A 10-year-old boy stands alone on a rain-soaked mountain highway at midnight. No parents, no car, no shoes. Just a scorched leather pouch clutched against his chest like a grenade. When former Marine biker Ronan Vale pulls over, the child doesn't cry, doesn't flinch. He extends the pouch with hands too steady for a kid that young and whispers 5 words that will unravel 15 years of buried lies. They left this for you. Inside, a burned map, half destroyed. One trail circled in charcoal, and an insignia Ronan hasn't seen since the night his brother vanished into a wildfire that was never supposed to happen. Before Ronan can speak, the boy disappears into the trees like smoke. Someone wanted him found, and now, whatever's waiting at the end of that map is coming whether he follows it or not. Stay with me until the very end because this story is about to take turns you will not see coming. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight, and let's ride. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight by the time Ronan Vale's headlight carved a weak corridor through the darkness on Route 9. November in the Cascades meant the kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin. It settled into the ribs, the knuckles, the space behind the eyes where old memories like to nest. His Harley lowrider groaned beneath him, the engine note swallowed by wind and the relentless hammering of water against asphalt. He should have pulled off 2 hours ago. Should have taken the exit near Dunmore and found some motel with a half-lit vacancy sign and a heater that rattled more than it worked. But Ronan didn't stop. He never stopped when the anniversary came around. 15 years to the day. 15 years since his older brother Callum had ridden into the Black Ridge wildfire as a volunteer rescue coordinator and never come back. They'd found a melted helmet, a charred radio, nothing else, not a bone, not a dog tag, not a single piece of the man who'd taught Ronan how to field strip an engine at 12 and how to keep breathing after their mother died when Ronan was 16. Callum Vale had been erased from the earth the way fire erases ink from paper, completely, irreversibly, without apology. Ronan flexed his left hand inside the soaked glove. The knuckles were stiff. Old fracture from Fallujah that never healed right. The VA told him surgery could fix it. He told the VA he'd rather feel the pain than owe them another appointment. That was Ronan. 38 years old, 2 combat tours, a Purple Heart he kept in a coffee can under his bathroom sink, and a body that remembered every bad decision even when his mind tried to forget. His beard was more gray than black now. His eyes had that particular flatness that people who'd seen certain things carried. Not dead, not empty, just calibrated to a frequency that most civilians couldn't hear. He rode alone. Had for years. The brothers he'd served with had scattered. Some to suburbs, some to bottles, some to graves. The motorcycle club he'd once prospected for, the Iron Ridge Volunteers, had dissolved 6 months after the wildfire. Too many members lost. Too much grief. The charter had been surrendered. The clubhouse sold. The patches returned to a lockbox nobody claimed. Ronan kept riding because stopping meant sitting still, and sitting still meant the memories came back with their boots on. The rain intensified. Visibility dropped to maybe 40 feet. Ronan downshifted, leaned into the curve where Route 9 bent along the edge of a ravine, and that's when his headlight caught something that made his stomach drop. A child, standing on the gravel shoulder beside an abandoned logging road. No coat, no shoes. A thin t-shirt plastered to a body so small it looked like the wind could carry it sideways into the gorge. The kid couldn't have been older than 10. Arms wrapped around something pressed to his chest. A dark bundle, leather or canvas, clutched the way a soldier clutches a wound. The boy's face was pale under the rain, eyes wide. Not crying. That was the part that unsettled Ronan more than anything. Kids standing alone on mountain highways at midnight should be crying. This one looked like he'd already finished with that a long time ago. Ronan brought the Harley to a stop 15 feet away, killed the engine. The sudden silence was enormous. Just the rain, the dripping trees, the distant groan of wind through the canyon. He pulled off his helmet and hung it on the handlebar. Water ran down his face immediately, pooling in the creases around his eyes. Hey! His voice came out rougher than he intended. You okay? The boy didn't answer, didn't move, just stared at Ronan with an expression that was too old for his face, something between recognition and resignation, like he'd been waiting here and had started to believe no one was coming. Kid? Ronan swung his leg off the bike. His boots hit the gravel with a crunch that echoed off the rock wall. Where are your parents? Nothing. The rain hammered the boy's thin shoulders. Ronan could see him shivering now, violent, involuntary tremors that shook his entire frame. But the kid's hands stayed locked around that bundle. Whatever it was, he wasn't letting go. Ronan took 2 steps forward, then 3. He moved the way he'd been trained. Slow, hands visible, voice low. The way you approach someone who's been through something you can't see yet. My name's Ronan. I'm not going to hurt you, but you're standing on the edge of a mountain road in the dark and it's 34 degrees out here, so I need you to talk to me. Can you do that? The boy's lips moved. No sound. Then again, barely a whisper under the rain. They left this for you. Ronan stopped walking. Something cold moved through his chest that had nothing to do with November. What did you say? The boy extended his arms. The bundle was a pouch, leather, old, cracked at the seams. It looked like it had been through fire. The edges were blackened and curled. The stitching had melted in places, fused into dark ridges that caught the faint light from Ronan's headlamp still glowing on the ground behind him. The kid held it out the way you'd hand someone a loaded weapon, carefully, seriously, with full knowledge of what it contained. They left this for you, the boy repeated, louder this time, steady, like he'd rehearsed it. Ronan took the pouch. The leather was cold and stiff in his hands. It smelled like smoke, not fresh smoke, but the deep embedded kind that soaks into material and never leaves. The kind that comes from a fire so hot it changes the molecular structure of everything it touches. He'd smelled it in a rock. He'd smelled it on the hillside above Black Ridge the day they told him Callum was gone. He looked up to ask the boy where he'd gotten it, who had sent him, how he'd ended up on this specific stretch of road on this specific night. The logging road was empty. The trees stood dark and dripping. The boy was gone. Ronan stood there for a long time, rain running off his shoulders, the pouch in his hands. The silence pressing in from every direction like the mountain itself was holding its breath. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line, the road behind him, the gravel shoulder where the kid's bare feet had left faint impressions already filling with water. Nothing. No footprints leading into the woods. No broken branches. No sound of small feet running through underbrush. The child had vanished the way smoke vanishes. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the darkness had simply gathered him back into itself. Ronan's hands were shaking when he opened the pouch. He told himself it was the cold. He knew it wasn't. Inside was a map. Folded twice, creased deep, printed on the kind of heavy topographic paper the Forest Service used to issue before everything went digital. Half of it was destroyed. Roads burned away, contour lines dissolved into black smears, entire grid squares reduced to ash-colored nothing. But the surviving half was still legible. Trail markers, elevation numbers. A network of logging roads that Ronan recognized instantly because he'd ridden every one of them in the weeks after the wildfire, searching for any trace of his brother the official teams had missed. One trail was circled in charcoal, heavy, deliberate strokes that had been ground into the paper with enough pressure to tear through the first layer. Whoever had marked it wanted it found, wanted it followed. And in the bottom corner, barely visible beneath the fire damage, was a small emblem that stopped Ronan's breathing. A mountain ridge silhouetted against a single flame. 2 crossed axes beneath it. The insignia of the Black Ridge Volunteer Rescue Crew, Callum's unit. The unit that had been declared destroyed. Every member, every record, every piece of equipment consumed by a wildfire that burned so hot it melted steel frames and turned granite to powder. The official report said nothing survived. The county sealed the investigation. The Forest Service archived the files. The families grieved and eventually stopped asking questions because the answers never changed. Nothing survived. That was the final word, but Ronan was holding a map with their insignia on it. A map that had been through fire and come out the other side. A map that someone, somehow, had preserved for 15 years and then handed to a barefoot child on a mountain highway on the exact anniversary of the disaster. Nothing survived. Someone was lying. He sat on the wet gravel beside his bike for 20 minutes. The rain didn't stop. He studied the map under the glow of his phone's flashlight, tracing the surviving roads with a fingertip that left faint smudges on the charred paper. The circled trail led deep into the backcountry northwest of Black Ridge. Terrain Ronan had never accessed during the search because the Forest Service had declared it structurally unstable after the fire. No roads in, no roads out. Restricted access for a decade and a half. He folded the map carefully and slid it inside his jacket, against his chest where his body heat would keep it dry. Then he pulled out his phone and scrolled through a contacts list that was mostly dead numbers, and people who'd moved on. He stopped on a name he hadn't called in 3 years. Mac Dugan picked up on the 7th ring. His voice sounded like he'd been asleep for a week or drinking for 2. Probably both. "Who's this?" "It's Ronan." Silence. Then a long exhale that crackled through the speaker. "Ronan Vale. Jesus. Somebody die?" "Not yet." Ronan paused. The rain was getting heavier. "I need you to meet me. Cedar Falls, the old truck stop off Highway 7. Tomorrow morning." "Cedar Falls is 4 hours from, I know how far it is." More silence. Ronan could hear Mac shifting, the creak of a mattress, maybe the click of a lamp being turned on. "What's this about?" "Black Ridge." The silence that followed was different, heavier, loaded with 15 years of things neither of them had said out loud. Mac Dugan had been Callum's best friend, had stood beside Ronan at the memorial where they buried an empty casket, had been the one who finally grabbed Ronan by the jacket and told him to stop searching because the mountain had taken everything and there was nothing left to find. "Ronan," Mac's voice had changed, quieter, careful. "We did this already. We tore that mountain apart for 6 weeks. You know what we found." "I know what we were told we found." "That's the same thing." "No, it isn't. And I can prove it. Cedar Falls. Oh, 700. Bring Elias if he's still breathing." He hung up before Mac could argue. Then he called Nico Barrett, who answered on the 2nd ring because Nico never slept, hadn't slept properly since Kandahar, survived on 4-hour intervals and black coffee and the particular wired alertness of a man whose nervous system had never fully stood down from combat. Nico didn't ask questions. He just said, "Where?" and wrote it down. Ronan rode through the rest of the night. The rain turned to sleet around 3 in the morning, then back to rain by dawn. He stopped once for gas at a station where the attendant looked at him like he was a ghost. Soaked, gray-faced, a man on a motorcycle in weather that would have killed a less stubborn person. Ronan bought black coffee and drank it standing beside the pumps. It tasted like it had been brewed yesterday and reheated twice. He drank it anyway. The warmth was the point, not the flavor. Cedar Falls was a town that had stopped trying. Population signs that hadn't been updated since the census 2 cycles ago. Storefronts with plywood where glass used to be. The truck stop sat at the edge of town like a tooth nobody had bothered to pull. Still functioning, technically, but only because the alternatives were worse. Ronan parked his bike under the rusted awning and walked inside. The floor was cracked linoleum. The lighting was the color of old nicotine. A woman behind the counter with tired eyes and a name tag that said Donna poured coffee without being asked. Mac arrived first. He came through the door like a man entering a room he expected to contain bad news. Shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes scanning. He was bigger than Ronan remembered, not fatter, just wider, the way men get when grief settles into the body, and the body responds by becoming harder to move. His beard was full, reddish-brown, shot through with white. He wore a canvas jacket with the collar turned up and boots that had seen more miles than most cars. He saw Ronan and stopped. They looked at each other across the empty diner for a long moment. No handshake, no greeting. Just 2 men measuring the distance between who they'd been and who they were now. "You look like hell," Mac said. "Sit down." Mac sat. Donna brought more coffee. Neither of them touched it. Ronan pulled the map from inside his jacket and laid it on the table between them. Max stared at it. His face didn't change, but his hands, resting flat on the formica, went very still. The kind of still that combat veterans recognize. The body's first response to a threat it hasn't classified yet. Where did you get this? A kid handed it to me on Route 9 last night. No parents, no car, barefoot. He said, "They left this for you," and then he disappeared. Max's eyes moved slowly across the burned paper. Ronan watched him find the insignia, watched the color leave his face in a way that had nothing to do with the diner's bad lighting. "This is their mark," Max said, almost a whisper. "Cal's unit." "I know. This can't exist. Everything was destroyed. The county confirmed what somebody told them to confirm." Ronan leaned forward. His voice was low, flat, controlled, but his eyes were burning. "Look at the circled trail. Northwest sector, past the restricted zone. That area was never searched, Mac. Not by us. Not by anybody. They told us the terrain was too unstable, and we believed them because we were exhausted and grieving and we didn't know what else to do. But somebody was up there. Somebody survived long enough to make this map, to hide it, and to arrange for it to find me 15 years later." Max sat back in the booth. His jaw worked silently. He picked up the coffee cup, looked at it, set it down without drinking. "Or somebody's playing you. You thought about that? Somebody who knows your history, knows what date it is, knows you ride that road every November? A 10-year-old kid, barefoot, in freezing rain, on a mountain highway at midnight. That's the kind of game someone plays?" Mac didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the answer was no. The door opened again. Elias Crow walked in like a man who'd been walking into rooms he didn't want to be in for his entire life. Quiet, deliberate, with the economy of movement that came from years of conserving energy for the moments that mattered. Elias was the oldest of them, 46. Cherokee on his mother's side, Irish on his father's, hair pulled back, silver at the temples, a face that revealed nothing and saw everything. He'd been a combat medic in the same battalion as Mac and Callum. After the service, he'd been one of the first to volunteer for the wildfire rescue. He was also the one who'd identified Callum's melted helmet in the debris field. That was the last time Ronan had seen Elias show any emotion. 7 years of silence after that. Christmas cards returned unopened, phone calls that rang into nothing. He stopped at the edge of the table, looked at Ronan, looked at the map. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a tectonic movement, deep and slow. "Elias," Ronan said, "I told myself I wouldn't come." Elias pulled a chair from the adjacent table and sat on it backward, arms folded across the back. "Drove 4.5 hours telling myself to turn around." "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." He nodded at the map. "That's real." It wasn't a question. Ronan felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. "How do you know?" "Because I've seen that paper before, Forest Service issue, 2008 batch. They stopped printing on that stock after the budget cuts in '09. Whoever made that map had access to materials that were supposed to have been incinerated with everything else." Elias looked at Ronan, and for the first time in 7 years, there was something alive in his eyes, something dangerous. "I identified your brother's helmet. I signed the form. I told you he was gone. And I've spent every day since then wondering if I was wrong." The words landed in the diner like a grenade with the pin pulled. Mac leaned forward. Ronan felt his chest tighten. "What are you saying, Elias?" "I'm saying the helmet was melted beyond recognition. I'm saying they told me it was Callum's based on location coordinates and a partial serial number that could have matched 6 different pieces of equipment. I'm saying I signed the form because a man from the county assessor's office stood over my shoulder and told me the families needed closure. And I'm saying I've been carrying that for 15 years because I didn't have anything better to offer." Nico Barrett arrived last, moving through the door with the coiled energy of a man who hadn't fully sat down since 2003. Lean, dark-eyed, a scar running from his left ear to his jawline that he never explained to anyone who hadn't been in Kandahar with him. He carried a paper bag with breakfast burritos from a gas station and a thermos of coffee that smelled strong enough to dissolve the linoleum. He didn't say hello. He put the food on the table, pulled up a chair, and looked at the map. "That's Northwest Sector," he said within 10 seconds. "Restricted since the fire. I tried to get access twice in 2012. Permit denied both times. No explanation." "You tried to get access?" Ronan stared at him. Nico shrugged, one shoulder, barely a movement. "I don't like closed doors. Never have. Something about that area bothered me during the search. The burn pattern was wrong. Fire doesn't move uphill the way it supposedly moved through that sector, not with the wind conditions they reported. I'm not a fire scientist, but I know what physics looks like when someone's lying about it." The four of them sat in that diner with bad coffee and cold burritos and a burned map between them, and the silence had a weight to it. The weight of years, of unanswered questions, of guilt and grief, and the slow erosion of certainty. Ronan looked at each of them. Mac, who carried his loyalty like a physical burden. Elias, who carried a lie he'd never believed. Nico, who carried suspicion he'd never been able to prove. All of them broken in different places, all of them still here. "I'm going up there," Ronan said. "The circled trail. Whatever's at the end of it, I'm going." "In November," Mac said, "into restricted backcountry. On motorcycles, with a burned map that's missing half its information." "Yes." Mac looked at Elias. Elias looked at Nico. Nico bit into a gas station burrito and chewed slowly. "I'll need to check my rear brake pads," Mac said. "Been pulling left." Elias just nodded. Nico swallowed. "When do we leave?" They left 2 hours later, 4 motorcycles rolling north on Highway 7, the road climbing through switchbacks that grew tighter and steeper as the terrain shifted from foothills to true mountain country. The rain had stopped, but the sky stayed the color of gunmetal, pressing down on the ridgeline like a hand trying to hold something underneath. The air was sharp. Pine resin and wet rock, and the metallic edge of approaching snow. Ronan led. Behind him, Max Road King rumbled with the particular deep-chested authority of a machine that had been maintained with obsessive care. Elias rode a stripped-down Sportster that made almost no sound, which suited him. Nico's bike was a Dyna that he'd rebuilt himself 3 times, each iteration leaner and faster, as if the machine was evolving alongside the restlessness that never let him stop. They followed the surviving roads on the map through terrain that grew increasingly hostile. Pavement gave way to gravel. Gravel gave way to dirt. Dirt gave way to ruts carved by years of rain with no maintenance. The logging roads that connected this part of the Cascades had been abandoned after the fire, left to the forest the way an unpaid debt is left to time. Everyone knew it was there. Nobody wanted to deal with it. Branches scraped against their saddlebags. Puddles concealed holes deep enough to swallow a front wheel. Every mile felt like a conversation with something that didn't want them here. They stopped at a ridge where the road forked. The left branch matched the map. The right one didn't exist on paper at all. Ronan killed his engine. The others pulled in beside him. For a moment, all they could hear was the tick of cooling metal and the wind moving through the trees like a slow exhalation. "There used to be a ranger station about 2 miles down the left fork," Nico said. He'd pulled a folded survey printout from his jacket, a bootleg copy he'd obtained years ago from a contact in the Forest Service. "Station 14. Operational from 1995 to 2009. Decommissioned after the fire." "Decommissioned or buried?" Elias asked. Nico's mouth thinned. "You tell me." They took the left fork. The road deteriorated immediately. Ruts deeper, tree cover denser, the canopy closing overhead until the gray sky was visible only in fragments. After a mile and a half, they came around a bend and stopped. The ranger station was there, or what was left of it. The structure had been a standard Forest Service modular. Corrugated steel walls, flat roof, radio tower. The roof had collapsed inward. The walls were streaked with 15 years of rust and lichen. The radio tower was bent at a 40-degree angle, leaning against a Douglas fir that had grown around it the way the forest reclaims everything human beings leave behind. But that wasn't what made Ronan's blood go cold. The door had been removed, not damaged by the fire, not collapsed by weather, removed. The hinges were clean cut, torch marks, precise and deliberate, and the interior, visible through the dark rectangle of the doorway, had been stripped. Every piece of equipment, every filing cabinet, every radio, every logbook, gone. Not destroyed, taken. Someone had come here after the fire, methodically, professionally, and erased everything. Elias stepped through the doorway first, pulling a flashlight from his jacket. The beam cut through the darkness inside, revealing bare walls. An empty floor with bolt marks where equipment racks had been anchored, and a chemical smell. Faint, old, but unmistakable. Accelerant, Elias said quietly. Somebody poured it, never lit it. He crouched, ran his fingertip along the floor. He came up with a faint residue. They were going to burn this place. Then they changed their mind, decided stripping it was cleaner. Or somebody interrupted them, Max said from the doorway. Nico was outside, circling the structure. He called out from the back, "Come look at this." They found him standing beside what appeared to be a section of the steel wall that had been cut and re-welded. The weld was amateur, rough beads, inconsistent heat, but it was recent, maybe within the last 5 years. Someone had opened the wall, accessed whatever was behind it, and sealed it back up. "What's behind that panel?" Ronan asked. "Only one way to find out." Nico pulled a multi-tool from his belt. It took 20 minutes to pry the panel open. Behind it was a cavity between the interior and exterior walls, a space about 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Inside, wrapped in black plastic sheeting, was a single object, a radio, Forest Service issue. The frequency dial was set to a channel that hadn't been used since the emergency network was decommissioned after the fire. And taped to the back of the radio was an index card with handwriting that Ronan recognized immediately. Callum's handwriting. 3 words, written in black marker, smudged but legible. "Don't trust Everett." Ronan's hands were trembling. Mac was standing so close behind him that Ronan could feel the heat of his breathing. "Who the hell is Everett?" Mac whispered. Ronan didn't answer. He was staring at the handwriting. He'd seen it on birthday cards, on letters from boot camp, on the note Callum had left on the kitchen table the morning he'd ridden out to join the wildfire rescue, a note Ronan still kept in his wallet, folded so many times the creases had worn through the paper. This was real. This was Callum's hand. His brother had been alive inside this station after the fire. Alive long enough to hide a radio. Alive long enough to write a warning. "Don't trust Everett." Ronan turned the card over. On the back, in smaller handwriting, hurried, pressed harder, the pen almost tearing through, were coordinates, latitude and longitude, and beneath them a single sentence that made the air leave Ronan's lungs. "The shelter is still there." They stood in the gutted ranger station with the rain starting again outside and the wind pushing through the empty doorway, and nobody spoke, because the implications of what they were holding had just rewritten 15 years of accepted truth, and none of them were ready for what that meant. Somewhere behind them, on the logging road they'd just ridden in on, an engine started. Not a motorcycle. Something heavier. A truck, maybe. Moving slowly. No headlights. Nico heard it first. His head snapped toward the doorway. His hand went to his hip, where instinct remembered a weapon that wasn't there anymore. "We've got company," he said. And the engine sound wasn't getting farther away. It was getting closer. The engine sound grew louder in the wet dark, a low diesel growl that bounced off the ridge walls and made it impossible to pinpoint direction. Nico was already moving, grabbing the radio and the index card, wrapping them back in the plastic sheeting, shoving the bundle inside his jacket. Max stepped to the doorway and pressed his back against the frame, one eye on the logging road. Elias killed his flashlight. The ranger station went black. Ronan didn't move. His hands were still open in front of him, palms up, as if Callum's handwriting had left a physical weight there. "Don't trust Everett. The shelter is still there." 15 years of believing his brother was ash and smoke, and now those words were burning through him hotter than any fire. "Ronan," Mac's voice, low, controlled, the voice of a man who'd called incoming coordinates under mortar fire. "We need to move, now!" Ronan blinked, came back, nodded once and crossed to the doorway. The logging road curved about 60 yards south before disappearing into the tree line, and somewhere beyond that curve, the diesel engine was idling, not advancing anymore, just sitting there, waiting. "One vehicle," Nico said. He'd come around the side of the station, moving low, his boots barely making sound on the wet gravel. "Parked just past the bend, no lights. Engine running." "Could be Forest Service," Mac said. "Forest Service doesn't run dark on a decommissioned road in November." Nico's jaw was tight. "And they don't sit and wait." Elias was already at his Sportster, pulling the bike off its stand with the silent efficiency of a man who'd practiced leaving places quickly. "We go north. There's a fire trail about a quarter-mile up that connects back to the main logging road. I saw it on the survey map." "In the dark?" Mac said. "On bikes? On wet terrain we've never ridden?" "You have a better idea?" Nobody did. They rolled the bikes by hand for the first 100 yards, engines off, tires crunching softly through gravel and pine needles. The diesel behind them stayed where it was, idling, patient, like an animal that had already decided where its prey was going and felt no need to rush. Ronan's pulse was steady, but his mind was racing, turning the pieces over the way he used to turn over tactical problems in the field. Somebody knew they were here. Somebody had been watching the ranger station, which meant somebody knew what was inside that wall, or at least knew enough to worry about who might come looking. They found the fire trail where Elias said it would be, a narrow cut through dense timber, barely wide enough for a single bike. Ronan started his engine first, keeping the RPMs low, letting the exhaust note muffle against the trees. The others followed, single file, no headlights, navigating by the thin gray light that filtered through the canopy from a sky that refused to fully darken or fully clear. The trail climbed for a mile before connecting to a wider service road that eventually dumped them back onto Highway 7, 4 miles north of where they'd turned off. They stopped at a pullout overlooking a valley filled with fog. The 4 bikes idled side by side, exhaust rising and dissolving into the November air. Nobody spoke for a full minute. They just sat on their machines and breathed and listened to the silence confirm that nothing had followed them. Mac was the first to break it. He swung off his Road King, pulled a crumpled pack of Camels from his jacket, and lit one with hands that were almost steady. The match flared orange against his face, shadows pooling in the hollows under his eyes. "All right." Smoke leaked from his mouth. "Start from the top. Who's Everett?" Ronan was still straddling his bike, both boots flat on the ground, staring at the fog-filled valley below. "I don't know. Your brother wrote it. Don't trust Everett. Not watch out for or be careful around. Don't trust. That's specific. That's personal. He knew the name. You telling me you've never heard it?" "I'm telling you I've never heard it." Mac took a long drag, held it, let the smoke out slow. "Then we need to find out who Callum knew that we didn't." Elias was sitting on his Sportster with his arms crossed, watching the exchange with the measured patience of a man assembling a diagnosis from symptoms that hadn't fully presented yet. Callum's rescue crew had 8 members. I knew 5 of them by name. The other 3 were Forest Service liaisons assigned to the operation, people I never met. County brought them in after the initial response overwhelmed the volunteer system. "You remember any names?" "I remember faces. I remember one of them smoked a pipe, which I thought was strange for a man working a fire line. I remember another one had a limp. Left leg, old injury, moved like it had been broken and set wrong." Elias paused. "I don't remember anyone named Everett, but I wasn't exactly cataloging introductions while people were dying." Nico had dismounted and was crouching beside his Dyna, pulling the plastic-wrapped radio from his jacket. He turned it over in his hands, examining it under the thin light. "The frequency this is set to, channel 14. That was the emergency relay used during the fire, coordinated between ground crews and the command post at Dunmore. After the fire, the channel was decommissioned, equipment recalled, frequencies reassigned. He looked up. But this radio was hidden after the fire, which means someone was still using Channel 14 when there was no official reason to. Unless they were talking to someone who never left the mountain, Ronan said. The silence that followed was different from the others, heavier, loaded with something none of them wanted to say out loud. Mac dropped his cigarette and ground it under his boot. The ember hissed against the wet asphalt. "Don't do that," Mac said quietly. "Don't start down that road." "What road?" "The road where your brother might still be alive. Because if you start walking that direction and you're wrong, it'll kill you worse than the first time did." Ronan looked at him. The flatness in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Not hope, because Ronan didn't traffic in hope anymore, but a cold, focused intensity that was more dangerous. The look of a man who'd found a mission. "I'm not saying he's alive. I'm saying he was alive after the fire, long enough to write a warning, long enough to hide evidence. And if he survived long enough for that, then whatever killed him wasn't the fire. It was something else, someone else." He let the words settle. "And whoever it was is still out there. Because someone cleaned that ranger station, someone welded that wall panel, and someone was sitting in a truck with no lights on a dead road tonight, waiting to see who showed up." Max stared at him for a long time. Then he turned away and walked to the edge of the pullout, standing with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the fog like it owed him something. Ronan watched his shoulders rise and fall. Mac was wrestling with it. They all were. The difference was that Mac had spent 15 years building a life on top of the grief. A wife in Boise, a welding shop, a routine that kept the darkness at arm's length. What Ronan was asking him to do was take a pickaxe to the foundation. "I need to say something." Elias's voice, measured, careful, the tone he used when he was about to deliver news that would change the shape of the room. "And none of you are going to like it." They all looked at him. "After the fire, when the county sealed the investigation, I requested copies of the incident report through a public records filing. Took 8 months. What I got back was heavily redacted, names blacked out, timelines missing, entire sections replaced with information withheld pursuant to ongoing review. I filed 3 appeals, all denied." "You never told me that," Ronan said. "I never told anyone, because what I found in the unredacted portions didn't make sense, and I didn't have enough to build a case. But one thing stuck with me." Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. An old flip phone, not a smartphone, because Elias didn't trust anything that tracked location. He opened it, scrolled through what looked like stored notes, and read aloud. Page 47 of the incident report. Quote, "Burn pattern analysis conducted by Everett Parish Associates, contracted through the County Assessor's Office. Findings consistent with natural wildfire propagation. No evidence of accelerant or intentional ignition." End quote. Ronan felt the ground shift under him, not physically, but something fundamental had moved. Everett Parish, a consulting firm, hired by the county to analyze the fire's origin and behavior. Their report is the basis for every official conclusion about Black Ridge. The entire finding that the fire was natural comes from one source, one firm, and the name on it is Everett. Mac had turned around from the overlook. His face was pale in the gray light. Cal wrote, "Don't trust Everett" on a card hidden inside a sealed wall with a radio tuned to a dead frequency, and the guy who determined the fire was natural, who gave the county the excuse to close the investigation, was named Everett. Or his firm was, Nico said. Could be a first name, last name, business name. "Doesn't matter," Ronan said. "What matters is Callum knew about them, knew enough to leave a warning. Which means whatever Everett Parish concluded in that report was a lie. And Callum had evidence. Evidence that somebody spent 15 years trying to erase," Elias added. The wind picked up, cold, carrying the smell of snow from higher elevations. Ronan looked at the map again, the circled trail, the coordinates on the back of the index card, the single sentence that kept echoing in his skull like the concussive aftershock of an explosion. "The shelter is still there. The coordinates on the card," he said. Did anyone check them? Nico already had his phone out, entering the numbers. The screen glowed pale blue against his scarred jawline. He stared at the result for a long time. Middle of nowhere, about 12 miles northwest of the ranger station, deep backcountry, no roads on any current map. He turned the phone so they could see. A satellite image showed dense forest, a ridgeline, and nothing else. But look at this. He zoomed in. Among the tree cover, barely visible, was a straight line, too straight to be natural. A cleared path, maybe. Or the remnant of a road that had been deliberately allowed to overgrow. That's our heading, Ronan said. That's 12 miles of restricted terrain with no trail, no support, and no cell service, Mac said. In November, with someone actively trying to keep us out. Yes. Mac closed his eyes, rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. When he opened them, he looked at Ronan with an expression that Ronan recognized from a different war. The look of a man who knows the mission is going sideways, but can't walk away from the people he's with. My wife thinks I'm visiting my cousin in Portland. What did you tell her? That I'd be back by Thursday. Mac lit another cigarette. His hands weren't shaking anymore. I'd like to keep that promise. I'll have you back by Wednesday. That's not funny. It wasn't a joke. They found a motel in a town called Willow Creek, 20 miles east of the restricted zone. The motel was called the Timber Lodge, which was generous. It was a row of 12 rooms with wood-paneled walls and carpet that smelled like the 1980s had died in it, and nobody had moved the body. They took 2 rooms, Mac and Nico in one, Ronan and Elias in the other. Ronan spread the map and the index card on the bed and stared at them the way he used to stare at tactical maps in the field, looking for what wasn't there, the negative space, the things that mattered precisely because someone had removed them. Elias sat in the room's only chair, a creaking wooden thing with a stained cushion, and watched Ronan without speaking. The silence between them was thick, textured, different from the silence between Ronan and the others, because Elias carried something the others didn't. He was the one who'd signed the form. He was the one who'd stood over a melted helmet and told a 23-year-old Ronan that his brother was dead. You could have told me, Ronan said without looking up. 7 years ago, 5 years ago, any time. Told you what? That I had doubts? That I wasn't sure? Elias's voice was quiet but unyielding. What would that have given you, Ronan? A reason to tear your life apart chasing something I couldn't confirm? You were barely holding together as it was. You'd already lost the apartment. You were sleeping in the back of a shop in Tacoma and drinking enough to put down a man twice your size. If I'd come to you with, I'm not sure your brother's dead, what would you have done with that? Ronan's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out like cables. I would have had the truth. You would have had a maybe, and a maybe would have destroyed you. Elias leaned forward. His dark eyes were steady, unwavering. I made a call, a bad one maybe, but I made it because I was trying to keep you alive. You can hate me for it. That's your right, but don't pretend the truth was simple because it never was. Ronan finally looked up. His eyes were wet, but his voice was controlled. Barely. He was my brother, Elias. I know. You took that from me, the chance to keep looking. I took the thing that was killing you and I put it in a box. Whether that saved your life or ruined it, I honestly don't know. I've gone back and forth on it every day for 7 years. That's why I stopped answering your calls. Not because I didn't care, because I couldn't look at you and carry the weight of what I'd done at the same time. The room was quiet. Outside, the parking lot lights buzzed with the particular frequency of failing fluorescent tubes. Ronan could hear Mac and Nico talking in low voices through the thin wall, Nico's rapid cadence against Mac's slow baritone, a rhythm that sounded like an argument being conducted at a volume designed to prevent eavesdropping. Ronan sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress creaked. He pressed his palms against his eyes and held them there. His breath was ragged, not crying, something beneath crying, something older and harder that didn't have a name. I'm not going to hate you, he said finally. I don't have room for that right now, but when this is over, you and I are going to have a longer conversation. Fair. And you're going to tell me everything, every doubt you had, every detail you noticed, every conversation with that county assessor's man who stood over your shoulder. Everything. I will. We square? We're not even close to square, but we're pointed in the same direction. That's enough for now. The knock on the door came at 11:30 that night. Not Mac's knock. Mac hit a door with the flat of his fist, 3 heavy beats, impossible to mistake. This was different. 2 light taps, a pause, then 2 more. Ronan was on his feet before the second set, crossing the room in 3 strides, one hand reaching for the door handle, every muscle in his body calibrated to a threat level his conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. Elias was already standing, flashlight in his hand like a weapon, positioned to the side of the door, where he'd be invisible when it opened. Ronan opened it. The boy stood on the concrete walkway in the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. Same kid. Same thin shirt, now dry but wrinkled, still no shoes. His feet were muddy and scratched, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes locked onto Ronan's with that same unsettling steadiness. Too calm, too focused, too old. "How did you find us?" Ronan said. The boy didn't answer the question. He reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Held it out. Ronan took it. The paper was a photocopy, grainy, slightly skewed, as if it had been copied in a hurry from a document someone wasn't supposed to have. It was a page from an official report. The header read, County of Barren Ridge, Datio Water Fire Origin Analysis. Final Determination. Halfway down the page, highlighted in yellow marker, was a paragraph. Ronan read it twice. His knuckles went white around the paper. The paragraph described the location of a subsurface ventilation shaft, part of an abandoned mining network beneath the northwest sector of Black Ridge. According to the report, the shaft had been sealed in 1987 and posed no structural risk. But scrawled in the margin, in handwriting that was not Callum's but was clearly hurried and frightened, were 3 words. Shaft is open. Below the words was a date. 4 days after the wildfire had been declared contained. 4 days after everyone stopped looking. Ronan looked up from the paper. The boy was watching him with an expression that cracked just slightly. The first sign of emotion Ronan had seen on that face. Not fear, not sadness. Something closer to urgency. The face of someone who needed Ronan to understand something that couldn't be said out loud. "Who wrote this?" Ronan asked. "My grandfather." It was the most the boy had ever spoken. 3 syllables. But they opened a door that Ronan felt swinging wide inside his chest. A door that led to rooms he hadn't known existed. "Your grandfather was part of the rescue crew." The boy shook his head, slowly, deliberately. He was the one who found them after. The words hit like a physical impact. Found them. Them. Not bodies, not remains. Them. Alive. Someone had found survivors of the Black Ridge wildfire, people who were supposed to be dead, and that someone was this child's grandfather. "Where's your grandfather now?" Elias asked from inside the room. The boy's face changed again. The crack widened. His lower lip moved, just barely, and Ronan recognized the movement, the micro-tremor of a child holding back something that was too big for his body to contain. "He died," the boy said, "last month. He made me promise." "Promise what?" "To find the biker who rides Route 9 every November." The boy looked directly at Ronan. "He said you'd never stop looking. He said you were the only one who wouldn't." Ronan crouched down, slowly, until he was at eye level with the child. The parking lot light threw long shadows across both their faces. Up close, Ronan could see the exhaustion in the boy's eyes, dark circles, a slight tremor in his jaw, the cumulative toll of carrying a dead man's mission on shoulders too small for it. "What's your name, kid?" "Jesse." "Jesse, where are you staying? Who's taking care of you?" The boy's eyes shifted. Not away, sideways. The way eyes move when someone is calculating how much truth to share. "I'm okay." "That's not what I asked." "I know." Jesse stepped back. 1 step, then another, moving toward the edge of the parking lot light, the way a wild animal moves toward the tree line, not running, but preparing for the option. There's more. In the shaft. Everything they hid, everything they buried, but you have to go before they do. Before who does? The men in the truck. Jesse's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. They came to my grandfather's house after he died. They took his papers. They missed the ones he hid for me. But they'll figure it out. They always figure it out. He looked over his shoulder into the darkness. They're already on the mountain. Jesse, wait. But the boy was gone, backing into the shadow between two parked trucks and then simply not being there anymore, the way he'd vanished on Route 9, the way he'd vanished at the ranger station. Not running, not hiding, just ceasing to exist in the visible spectrum, as if the darkness itself was protecting him. Ronan stood in the parking lot with the photocopied report in one hand and 15 years of grief rearranging themselves inside his chest. Mac and Nico had come out of their room. Mac was standing in the doorway in a t-shirt and jeans, barefoot, cigarette unlit between his fingers, staring at Ronan with an expression that said he'd heard every word through the wall. "You heard?" Ronan said. "Enough. The shaft is open. There's a ventilation shaft in the northwest sector that someone opened after the fire. Callum's shelter, whatever he was talking about on that card, it's underground, and someone has been protecting it." Mac didn't respond. He was looking at the spot where Jesse had disappeared, his face working through emotions he was too disciplined to name. Then he put the unlit cigarette behind his ear, stepped back into his room, and came back 30 seconds later with his boots on and his jacket zipped. "Let's go see it," he said. "Now? You said they're already on the mountain. That kid said they're ahead of us, so either we go now in the dark on terrain we don't know, or we go in the morning and find another stripped room." Mac's eyes were hard, not angry, decided. "I drove 4 hours because you called. I left my wife with a lie because I owed your brother more than I ever gave him. If there's something in that mountain that proves what happened to Cal, I'm not waiting for daylight while someone else burns it." Nico was already pulling his jacket on. Elias appeared in the doorway behind Ronan, boots laced, flashlight in his hand. 4 men, 4 motorcycles. A burned map with half its roads gone. A dead man's warning. A living child's promise. And 12 miles of restricted backcountry in the dark, with unknown hostiles already moving ahead of them. Ronan looked at each of them. Mac, who'd lied to his wife to be here. Elias, who'd carried a 7-year guilt that was eating him alive. Nico, who hadn't slept through a full night since a war that ended over a decade ago, but never really ended at all. Broken men, every one of them. Standing in a parking lot in the middle of nowhere, choosing to ride into something that could get them killed, for a dead man's truth that the world had decided didn't matter. But it mattered to them. It mattered because Callum had mattered. Because the men and women on that rescue crew had mattered. Because someone had set a fire and buried the evidence and let families grieve over empty caskets, and the only people left who cared enough to do something about it were 4 wounded veterans who couldn't even fix their own lives. Ronan straddled his Harley. The leather seat was cold through his jeans. The engine turned over on the first kick, a deep, guttural sound that echoed off the motel walls and rolled into the trees beyond the parking lot. Behind him, 3 more engines answered. Mac's Road King, Ellis's Sportster, Nico's Dyna. 4 heartbeats of American steel synchronizing in the cold mountain dark. He pulled the map from his jacket one last time, studied the circled trail, matched it against the coordinates on the index card, memorized the heading. Then he folded the map and put it away, because where they were going now wasn't on any paper. It was in the space between what they'd been told and what was actually true. And the only road that led there was the one they'd have to cut through the darkness themselves. Ronan clicked the headlight on. A cone of white light punched into the night. He pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. The others followed. 4 bikes turning north onto a road that had no name, heading into mountains that had kept their secrets for 15 years. And behind them, on the shoulder of the highway, parked in the shadow of a stand of pines with its engine off and its lights dead, sat a black truck. Its driver watched the 4 red taillights climb the grade and disappear around the first switchback. Then he picked up a radio handset and pressed the transmit button. "They're moving. Northwest route, 4 bikes. They've got the kids' papers. Static. Then a voice on the other end. Calm. Controlled. The voice of a man accustomed to handling problems that were supposed to have been solved a long time ago. Let them go. Let them find it. It's easier to bury 5 men than to find what they're looking for before they do. The radio clicked off. The truck sat in the darkness. And on the mountain above, 4 headlights climbed higher into the black timber, heading toward a truth that someone had already decided they wouldn't survive. The logging road ended without warning. One moment there was gravel under their tires, and the next there was nothing. Just a wall of fallen timber and overgrown earth where the road had been swallowed by 15 years of mountain reclamation. Ronan braked hard. His front tire skidded on wet pine needles, and the Harley fishtailed 6 inches before stopping. Behind him, Max Road King growled to a halt. Then Elias. Then Nico. 4 engines idling in the dark, headlights throwing overlapping cones of white into a tangle of deadfall and fern that looked like the forest had deliberately closed the door. Ronan killed his engine. The silence was immediate and total. The kind of silence that exists only in deep wilderness at altitude, where there's nothing between you and the sky but cold air and the memory of sound. He pulled the map from his jacket, studied it under his headlamp. The circled trail should have continued another 3 miles northwest before reaching the coordinates on the index card. But the road was gone. Not washed out, not collapsed, overgrown, intentionally abandoned and allowed to disappear. "This is where the restricted zone starts," Nico said. He was off his bike, crouching at the edge of the deadfall, running his flashlight along the ground. "Look at this." Ronan walked over. Nico's light was aimed at a section of fallen timber that crossed the road like a barricade. The trees hadn't fallen naturally. The cuts were clean, chainsaw work, precise and deliberate. The trunks dropped in an interlocking pattern designed to block vehicle access while appearing natural to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. "Someone built this," Ronan said, "years ago. Look at the regrowth around the cut points. 5 years minimum, maybe more." Nico stood, his breath fogged in the cold air. Someone wanted to make sure nobody could drive in here. Not hikers, not Forest Service, not anyone. "We go on foot," Elias said. He'd already pulled a small pack from his saddlebag. Water, first aid kit, the flashlight, a folding knife. The combat medic in him never fully retired. "We can follow the old roadbed. It'll still be there under the overgrowth. Ground doesn't forget where roads used to be." They hid the bikes in a stand of dense fir about 30 yards off the road, covering them with branches and dead fern until they were invisible from more than 10 feet away. Ronan hated leaving the Harley. It felt like leaving a part of himself exposed, vulnerable, the way a soldier feels walking away from a weapon. But there was no choice. Where they were going, the machines couldn't follow. They moved in single file, Nico on point because his night vision was the best. A gift from Kandahar that he'd paid for in ways none of them talked about. Ronan behind him, then Mac, then Elias covering the rear. The forest floor was soft with decomposition, layers of pine needles and rotting wood that muffled their footsteps and released a rich, dark smell of earth and decay. The canopy above was so thick that even the faint gray of the overcast sky was invisible. They moved by flashlight, keeping the beams low, pointed at the ground. The old roadbed was still there, just as Elias had predicted. A slightly depressed line through the terrain where the soil had been compacted by decades of vehicle traffic and hadn't fully recovered. They followed it through switchbacks that climbed the ridge at a gradual angle, the elevation increasing steadily, the air growing thinner and colder with every quarter mile. An hour in, Nico stopped, raised his fist. The signal was instinctive. None of them had served together, but the language was universal. Everyone froze. Ronan felt his heartbeat slow the way it always did when his body shifted into tactical mode, the conscious mind stepping back to let the trained animal underneath take over. "Light," Nico whispered. 200 yards. 9 o'clock. Ronan looked. Through the trees, barely visible, a faint glow. Not a flashlight, not a fire. Something steadier. Yellowish, the kind of light that comes from a battery-powered lantern inside an enclosed space. They moved off the roadbed and into the timber, covering the distance in slow, careful increments, pausing every 20 yards to listen. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional drip of moisture from the canopy and the distant, barely audible hum of wind across the ridgeline above them. As they got closer, the light resolved into a definite shape, a rectangle, low to the ground, emanating from what appeared to be a gap in the earth itself. It was a hatch, steel-framed, set into a concrete pad that had been poured directly into the forest floor and covered with a thin layer of soil and debris. The hatch was open about 6 inches, propped by a rock, and the light was coming from below. Ronan could see the top of a metal ladder descending into the glow. Nico moved to the far side of the hatch. Mac took the near side. Elias crouched behind a fallen log 10 feet back, watching the perimeter. Ronan approached the opening and knelt beside it. The air rising from below was warmer than the surface, stale, recycled, carrying the faint chemical tang of preservative and old paper. He leaned closer and listened. Voices. 2 men. Speaking in low, clipped tones that echoed faintly off hard walls. Ronan couldn't make out words, but the cadence was businesslike, not casual conversation. Instructions, coordination, the sound of people executing a task on a timeline. He looked at Mac. Mac's face was set in granite. He gave a single nod. Ronan eased the hatch open another 8 inches, slowly, the hinges groaning with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The voices below didn't stop. He swung his legs over the edge, found the ladder with his boots, and descended. The shaft went down about 20 feet. The walls were concrete, poured, reinforced, military-grade construction that had no business being in the middle of a national forest. At the bottom, a corridor extended in both directions, lit by a string of battery lanterns hung from hooks in the ceiling. The air was thick and warm. The floor was poured concrete with drainage channels along the edges. This wasn't a mine shaft. This wasn't a natural cave. This was a built structure, a bunker, a shelter, something designed and constructed with deliberate purpose and serious resources. Ronan pressed his back against the wall and moved toward the voices. The corridor curved to the right, and as he rounded the bend, the space opened into a room roughly 30 feet square. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls. Metal shelving units held plastic storage bins labeled with dates and reference numbers. A folding table in the center was covered with papers, and standing over the table were 2 men in civilian clothing, heavy jackets, work boots, no insignia, sorting documents into cardboard boxes with the focused efficiency of people who'd done this before. They were packing, stripping the room the same way someone had stripped the ranger station, removing every trace. Ronan could see that several of the filing cabinets were already empty, their drawers hanging open like mouths with nothing left to say. He pressed deeper into the shadow of the corridor, barely breathing. One of the men straightened up from the table and spoke loud enough for Ronan to hear clearly for the first time. "Third box is full. That's the radio logs and the incident journals through August. The personal effects are in the back room. Parrish wants those destroyed, not transported." The other man didn't look up. "You say why?" "DNA. They can match family members now with stuff that wouldn't have been testable 10 years ago. A toothbrush, a razor, a hat. Any of it could prove someone was alive down here after the official timeline. He wants it incinerated." Ronan felt something crack inside his chest. Not a physical sensation, something structural. A load-bearing wall in the architecture of his grief that had held everything else in place for 15 years. They were talking about destroying evidence that people had survived. Personal effects, toothbrushes, razors. The intimate, mundane artifacts of people who had been alive, eating, sleeping, shaving, in this underground shelter after the world above had declared them dead. Callum had been here, alive, using a razor, drinking from a cup, writing in a journal, breathing, and someone named Parrish wanted every trace of it burned. Ronan's vision narrowed. His hands were fists at his sides, the knuckles white, the old fracture in his left hand screaming with a pain he barely registered. Every instinct in his body was pulling him in 2 directions simultaneously, forward toward the men, toward violence, toward the primal satisfaction of putting his hands on someone who had participated in burying his brother twice, and backward, toward caution, toward strategy, toward the cold calculation that had kept him alive in places far more dangerous than an underground bunker in the Cascades. A hand closed on his shoulder. Mac. The grip was firm, grounding, the physical language of a man who recognized what was happening inside Ronan and was applying the only brake that would work. Ronan looked at him. Mac shook his head once. Slowly. His eyes said everything. Not yet. Not like this. Nico and Elias had descended behind them. The four of them stood in the corridor, pressed against the concrete wall, listening to two men casually discuss the destruction of evidence that would have rewritten history. Elias had his phone out, recording. The old flip phone's microphone was primitive, but in the silence of the bunker, every word was audible. The first man spoke again. "How much time do we have?" "Parrish said the bikers are on the mountain, probably hit the barricade and turned back, but he wants the site cleaned by dawn regardless. The thermite charges are in the utility room." Thermite. Ronan's stomach dropped. Thermite burns at over 4,000 degrees. It would destroy everything in this bunker: papers, metal, concrete. It would turn the entire shelter into a sealed tomb of molten slag. Whatever evidence Callum and the others had preserved, whatever truth had survived 15 years underground, would be gone in minutes. Nico tapped Ronan's arm, pointed deeper into the corridor, past the room where the men were working. Another corridor branched off to the left, unlit, disappearing into darkness. Ronan nodded. They moved. The left corridor was narrower. No lanterns. They navigated by the thin beams of their flashlights held against their palms to reduce the glow. The air was different here, colder, damper, with a staleness that suggested this section hadn't been opened in a long time. The concrete walls gave way to raw rock, and the floor transitioned from poured concrete to rough-hewn stone. They were moving deeper into the mountain. After 60 yards, the corridor opened into a second room. This one was smaller, maybe 15 feet square, and it had been lived in. Ronan's flashlight swept across the space, and his legs almost gave out. Cots. 6 of them. Arranged along the walls with military precision. Blankets folded, pillows positioned. The deliberate order of people maintaining discipline in confined quarters. A table in the center held a battery-powered lantern, a stack of notebooks, 2 mugs, a can of instant coffee with a rusted lid. Against the far wall, a metal shelf held personal items arranged with the careful organization of people who had very little and treated each object as essential. A wristwatch, a pocket knife, a photograph in a simple frame, 3 folded shirts, a pair of reading glasses, a harmonica. These were people's things. Real people. People who had lived here, eaten here, slept here, survived here. While their families mourned and the county filed its reports and the world moved on, these people had been underground, in the dark, in the belly of a mountain that everyone believed had killed them. Ronan picked up the photograph. His flashlight trembled. It showed 6 people standing in front of a fire lookout tower. Summer, blue sky. They were smiling, wearing Forest Service uniforms and volunteer rescue vests. Callum was on the far right. Taller than Ronan remembered, or maybe memory had made him smaller over the years the way grief diminishes everything it touches. He had his arm around the shoulder of a woman Ronan didn't recognize. Dark hair, strong jaw, eyes that even in a photograph communicated fierce intelligence. On the far left was a man in his 60s with a thick white beard and a volunteer patch on his chest. He was holding the hand of a young boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Ronan turned the photograph over, written on the back in Callum's handwriting. Crew 7, Black Ridge, June 2009. 3 months before everything. 3 months before the fire. Mac was standing beside him, looking at the photograph over Ronan's shoulder. His breathing had changed. Ragged, uneven, the sound of a man whose emotional infrastructure was failing. "That's him," Mac said. "That's Cal." "I know." "The older man, with the kid." Mac pointed. "Look at his vest, the patch." Ronan looked. The volunteer patch on the old man's vest was different from the others. It bore an additional insignia, a small embroidered symbol beneath the standard rescue logo, a mountain ridge, a single flame, two crossed axes, the Black Ridge Volunteer Rescue Crew emblem, the same emblem that was on the burned map. That could be Jesse's grandfather, Elias said quietly. He'd moved to the shelf and was examining the notebooks. The age would be right. If the boy is 10 now, and this photo was taken 17 years ago, the child in the photo would be around 21 or 22 today, could be the boy's father. Which means 3 generations of this family have been connected to whatever happened here, Nico said. He was crouching by the cots, examining the blankets. These haven't been slept in for a long time, but they were used extensively. Look at the wear patterns. Someone lived on these cots for months, maybe longer. Ronan set the photograph down and picked up the top notebook from the stack on the table. The cover was plain, no name. He opened it to the first page. Callum's handwriting, dense, small, covering every inch of the page. Dated entries. The first one was 3 days after the official date of the wildfire. He began to read, and the world he'd lived in for 15 years started to come apart at the seams. The entries described chaos. The fire had started in the southeast sector and moved northwest with a speed and intensity that defied the weather conditions. Callum's crew had been positioned at a forward observation post when the fire line changed direction without warning. Not from wind, not from terrain channeling, but from a secondary ignition point that shouldn't have existed. Someone had started a second fire, deliberately, on the opposite side of the ridge from the main blaze, creating a pincer movement that trapped Crew 7 between 2 advancing walls of flame. They'd retreated to the only shelter available, the underground bunker, which had been built decades earlier as part of a mining ventilation system and repurposed by the Forest Service as an emergency refuge. They'd sealed the hatch and waited. The fire had passed over them. They'd survived, all 6 of them. And then they'd tried to leave. The hatch wouldn't open, not because of debris, because it had been locked from the outside, bolted, sealed with hardware that hadn't been there before the fire. Someone had trapped them underground while the mountain burned above them. Ronan's hands were shaking so badly that the notebook pages rattled. He kept reading. Mac was beside him, reading over his shoulder, and at some point Mac's hand came up and gripped the edge of the table so hard the metal creaked. Callum's entries continued for weeks. The crew had supplies, emergency rations, water, the materials that had been stocked in the bunker as part of its original purpose. They had a radio, but every frequency was dead. They had flashlights, candles, and eventually the battery-powered lanterns they'd found in a storage compartment. They rationed everything. They organized watches. They maintained discipline because Callum insisted on it, because without structure, the darkness and the confinement and the knowledge of what had been done to them would have broken them. 2 weeks after the fire, someone opened the hatch from outside, not to rescue them, to deliver supplies, water, food, medical materials, and a note, typed on plain paper with no signature, "Stay below. You are being protected. The investigation must conclude first." The crew debated. Some wanted to force their way out immediately. Callum argued against it. His reasoning, laid out in the journal with the methodical clarity of a man trained to assess tactical situations, was brutal in its logic. Whoever had set the second fire and sealed the hatch had done so deliberately. They had the resources to burn an entire mountainside and the connections to manipulate the investigation. If Crew 7 surfaced before the investigation concluded, they'd be silenced permanently. Underground, they were hidden, alive. Their survival itself was the evidence that could eventually expose the truth. Not everyone agreed. The entry from week 3 described an argument that nearly tore the crew apart. The woman in the photograph, her name was Dr. Marin Ash, a Forest Service ecologist who had volunteered for the rescue, argued that their families deserved to know they were alive, that every day they stayed hidden was another day their loved ones grieved needlessly. Callum's response, recorded in his own handwriting with a rawness that was almost unbearable to read, was 3 sentences. "She's right. I know she's right, and we still can't go up." Ronan closed his eyes. The notebook trembled in his hands. He could hear Callum's voice in the words, the cadence, the stubborn precision, the way his brother had always been able to see a problem from every angle and still choose the hardest path because it was the only one that led somewhere true. Callum had sat in this room on one of these cots and made the decision to let Ronan believe he was dead, to let Mac believe it, to let all of them believe it, not out of cruelty, not out of cowardice, out of the same brutal, clear-eyed calculation that had made him the best tactical mind in their battalion and the worst person to love, because loving Callum meant accepting that he would always choose the mission over the people who needed him. And Ronan had needed him, desperately. At 23, with no parents, no family, no anchor, he'd needed his brother to be alive more than he'd needed air, and Callum had chosen to let him suffocate. "Ronan," Elias's voice, close, careful, the voice he used when a patient was going into shock.
"Put the journal down for a minute." "No. You're hyperventilating." "I said no." Mac's hand landed on the notebook, firm, covering the page. Ronan looked up at him, and for a moment the two men stared at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with the space between them. Mac's eyes were wet. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like rope. "He chose this," Mac said. "Cal chose to stay, to protect the evidence, to protect them." His voice cracked on the last word. He cleared his throat. He was always like that, always the one who'd carry the heavier pack, even if it broke his back. "He let us grieve for nothing." "He let us grieve so we'd be alive to find this." Ronan stared at him. The logic was there. Ugly, ruthless, unmistakable. If the crew had surfaced immediately, whoever orchestrated the fire would have killed them and destroyed the evidence. By staying hidden, they'd preserved everything. The journals, the radio logs, the personal effects that could now be tested. The truth. Callum had sacrificed his family's peace of mind to ensure that the truth would survive, and he trusted that someday someone would come looking. "There's more," Elias said. He'd been reading ahead in the other notebooks, moving quickly through the pages with the clinical focus of a man processing information under pressure. "The entries continue for 4 months, then they stop. All of them, same date." He held up the last notebook. The final page had a single entry. Different handwriting, not Callum's. Larger, shakier, the writing of someone in distress. "They found us. Cal is taking the evidence out through the mining shaft. Marin and David are going with him. The rest of us stay to buy time. If anyone finds this, tell them we were here. Tell them the fire was murder." Ronan read the words 3 times. Each time they hit harder. The fire was murder. Not an accident, not a natural disaster. Murder. Premeditated, engineered, deliberate murder disguised as a wildfire. Designed to kill the people who knew too much and bury the evidence with them. "Who found them?" Nico asked. He was standing by the corridor entrance, one ear turned toward the passage they'd come through, monitoring for the 2 men in the other room. "The entry says, 'They found us.'" "Who's they?" Elias flipped through the preceding pages. "The last few entries mention increased activity above ground. Vehicles, drilling sounds. The crew believed someone was systematically searching the mountain. Callum's entry from 2 days before the final one says..." He paused. Read directly from the page, his voice flat and controlled. "Everett's people are close. We can hear them above the east corridor. They're using ground-penetrating radar. We have maybe 72 hours before they locate the main chamber." Everett. The name again, threading through everything like a wire buried in the structure of the lie. "Everett Parish Associates," Ronan said. "The firm that analyzed the fire origin. They didn't just write the report. They were actively searching for survivors. They knew the crew was alive. They knew about the bunker. And they were trying to find them." "Not to rescue them," Max said. "No, not to rescue them." The full picture was assembling itself in Ronan's mind with the terrible clarity of a photograph developing in acid. The outlines first, then the details, each one more damning than the last. Someone, Everett, Parrish, whoever was behind them, had orchestrated the wildfire to destroy evidence of something.
The rescue crew had stumbled into the middle of it. Instead of killing them directly, which would have drawn investigation, they'd sealed them underground and waited. Controlled the narrative above. Filed the false fire origin report. Closed the investigation. Let the families grieve and the world forget. Then, when enough time had passed, they'd started searching for the bunker to finish what the fire had started. And now they were here again, with thermite charges, ready to erase the last traces for good. "We need to get these journals out," Ronan said. His voice had changed. The grief was still there, a deep structural ache that would never fully heal. But layered over it was something harder, something made of the same material his brother had been made of. Mission focus. The cold clarity of a man who finally understood what he'd been put on this earth to do. Every notebook, every document, the photograph, the personal effects, everything in this room. "There are 2 armed men in the next section," Nico reminded him. "I didn't say it would be easy." "No, you said we need to get the journals out. I'm clarifying the obstacle." Nico's scarred face was unreadable. "They mentioned thermite. That means they've got charges set, which means there's a timer or a trigger somewhere. If they're working to a dawn deadline, we've got maybe 3 hours." Elias was already loading notebooks into his pack. Mac was pulling plastic bins from the shelves, checking contents, prioritizing. They worked with the practiced coordination of men who'd operated under pressure before. No wasted motion, no unnecessary talk. Each person instinctively filling the gaps the others left. Ronan picked up the photograph again. Callum's face, smiling. The arm around Marinash's shoulder. The older man holding the little boy's hand. He slipped the photograph inside his jacket, against his chest, the same place he'd carried the burned map. Then he picked up Callum's first journal and opened it to the last entry in his brother's handwriting. The final words Callum had written before leaving through the mining shaft with the evidence. The entry was short. 4 lines. "I don't know if I'll make it out. If I don't, and someone finds this, find Ronan, my brother. He'll be on Route 9 in November. He'll still be looking. He won't stop. Tell him I'm sorry I couldn't come home. Tell him the map will find him when he's ready." Ronan closed the journal. His jaw was locked so tight he could feel his teeth grinding. His eyes burned, but nothing fell. Not here. Not yet. Not in this room where his brother had chosen duty over family and left behind the only apology he could afford. From the corridor came the sound of heavy footsteps, moving faster now, and a voice, one of the men from the main room, raised, sharp, no longer calm. "Hey, someone's been in the back section. There's fresh boot prints on the floor." Nico moved first. He crossed the room in 3 strides, positioned himself at the corridor entrance, back against the wall, flashlight off. Mac was right behind him. Elias zipped his pack, heavy with notebooks, and slung it over both shoulders. Ronan shoved the last 2 journals into his own jacket, the hard spines pressing against his ribs. The footsteps were getting closer. Flashlight beams swept down the corridor, casting long shadows that moved like searching fingers along the rough stone walls. "There's another way out," Elias said. His voice was barely a whisper. "The mining shaft Callum mentioned in the journal. He said he took the evidence out through it. It has to connect to this section somewhere." Ronan swept his flashlight along the back wall of the room. Concrete. Solid. But in the far corner, partially obscured by the metal shelving unit, was a seam. A vertical line where the concrete ended and raw rock began. And at the base of the seam, a gap. Maybe 2 feet high, barely visible behind the lowest shelf. "There," Ronan said. They moved the shelf. It scraped against the floor with a sound that echoed down the corridor like a gunshot. The footsteps behind them broke into a run. Behind the shelf was a passage, not a corridor, a crawl space. Rough-hewn rock, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, angling downward into complete darkness. Cold air flowed from it, not the recycled warmth of the bunker, but the raw mineral breath of deep earth. "Go," Nico said. He wasn't looking at the passage. He was looking back down the corridor, his body positioned between the entrance and the others. The footsteps were 30 yards away. 20. I'll hold them. Go now. Nico, I said go. Mac grabbed Ronan's arm and pulled him toward the passage. Elias was already dropping to his knees, feeding himself into the opening head first, the heavy pack scraping against the ceiling. Ronan went next, the journals digging into his ribs as he squeezed through the gap. Mac followed, his broader frame barely fitting, his breathing harsh and compressed in the tight space. Behind them, in the room they'd just left, Ronan heard Nico's voice, calm, level, carrying the authority of a man who'd spent a career standing between danger and the people behind him. That's far enough. Then other voices, angry, overlapping, and the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, and then running, but not toward them, away, back up the corridor, and Nico's boots following at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried, the sound of a man who understood that the best way to create time was to occupy the space your enemy wanted to move through. The crawl space narrowed, then widened, then opened into a shaft, vertical, with rusted iron rungs hammered into the rock wall, climbing upward into darkness. Cold air poured down from above, carrying the smell of pine and rain and the unmistakable sweetness of open sky. Elias was already climbing. Ronan gripped the first rung. The metal was ice cold and slick with condensation. He climbed, 30 feet, 40. His arms burned. The journals in his jacket shifted with every movement, threatening to slide free. He gripped tighter. Above him, Elias pushed through something, a hatch, a cover, and gray light flooded down the shaft. Dawn. The sky was the color of pewter, barely distinguishable from the clouds. But after the darkness underground, it felt like staring into a floodlight. Ronan hauled himself through the opening and collapsed onto wet pine needles, gasping. They were on the mountainside, above the bunker. The forest stretched in every direction, dripping and silent. Mac emerged next, pulling himself through the shaft opening with a grunt, rolling onto his back, chest heaving. His face was flushed and streaked with grime. "Nico," Mac said between breaths. Ronan was already on his feet, looking back down the shaft. The darkness below was total. No sound, no light, no footsteps on the rungs. "Nico!" he called down. His voice echoed off the rock walls and came back empty. 20 seconds, 30, a minute. Then the scrape of metal, the ring of boots on iron rungs. Nico's scarred face appeared in the shaft opening, climbing with one arm. His left arm hung at his side, and even in the gray dawn light, Ronan could see the dark stain spreading from his shoulder down the sleeve of his jacket. Mac and Ronan grabbed him and pulled him through. Nico's jaw was clenched so tight the scar on his face stood out like a white wire. Blood was soaking through his jacket at a rate that made Elias drop his pack and start cutting fabric before Nico was fully on the ground. "Knife," Nico said through his teeth. "One of them had a knife. I didn't see it." "Hold still." Elias had the wound exposed, a deep laceration across the deltoid, bleeding freely but missing the artery. He packed it with gauze from his kit, applied pressure, and started wrapping. His hands were steady. His face was not. Nico looked at Ronan. Despite the pain, despite the blood, his dark eyes were sharp, focused. The eyes of a man who'd just traded a piece of himself for something he considered worthwhile. "I blocked the passage," he said, "pulled the shelf across it from the inside. They'll get through, but it'll take time." "How much time?" "Not enough." Nico winced as Elias tightened the wrap. "They'll go out the main hatch and come around the mountain. 20 minutes. Maybe 30. He looked at the gray sky, orienting himself. "And they've got radios. They'll call it in." Ronan stood, the journals pressed against his ribs. Callum's photograph pressed against his heart. The dawn was cold and wet, and utterly indifferent to what they'd found underground, to the truth, to the murder, to the 15 years of silence that had just been shattered by 4 men who shouldn't have made it this far. From somewhere below and to the east, carried on the morning air with the clarity that mountain acoustics produce, came the sound of engines. Not one, several. Heavy vehicles moving in the service road they'd hiked in on, moving toward the barricade, moving fast. And behind the engines, fainter but unmistakable, The rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors cutting through the cloud ceiling, descending toward the ridge. Ronan looked at his brothers. Mac, mud-streaked and breathing hard. Elias, hands bloody from tending Nico's wound. Nico, pale but already trying to stand, one arm wrapped tight against his body. All of them carrying evidence that could bring down whatever structure had been built on top of his brother's grave. All of them standing on an exposed mountainside with no vehicles, no weapons, and no way off the ridge that didn't go straight through whoever was coming for them. "The mining shaft," Elias said. He was looking at the topographic survey printout from Nico's jacket, now spotted with blood. Callum took evidence out through a shaft that connects to the old mining network. "If this is the ventilation exit, the main shaft has to be somewhere on the northwest face. It'll come out lower on the mountain, closer to the road, closer to the bikes. If it's still passable," Max said. "If it isn't, we die on this ridge." Elias folded the printout, "Which we also do if we stand here talking about it." Ronan made the calculation in the time it took to draw one breath. The vehicles below were maybe 15 minutes from the barricade. The helicopter was 5 minutes from the ridgeline. The northwest face was a steep descent through dense timber with no trail. Nico was wounded. They were carrying irreplaceable evidence, and the men coming for them had already demonstrated a willingness to kill everyone who knew what was buried in that mountain. There was no version of this where everyone walked away clean. The only question was whether the truth walked away with them. Ronan looked at the shaft opening one last time. Down there, in the dark, were the cots where his brother had slept, the mugs he'd drunk from, the room where he'd written his final words and trusted that somehow, someday, his little brother would find them. Then Ronan turned northwest and started moving down the mountainside, into the trees, into the unknown, carrying his brother's truth against his chest like a second heartbeat. And behind him, 3 wounded men followed without a word, because some roads only go one direction, and the 4 of them had passed the last place where turning back was still an option. They moved down the northwest face at a pace that was reckless by any standard and necessary by every measure that mattered. The slope was steep, 40 degrees in places. The ground slick with decomposing pine needles and moss that gave way under their boots like rotten fabric. Ronan led, one arm braced against tree trunks for balance, the other pressed against the journals inside his jacket to keep them from shifting. Behind him, Mac moved with the heavy deliberation of a man whose knees had been complaining since Afghanistan and were now screaming. Elias stayed close to Nico, one hand hovering near the wounded man's good shoulder, ready to catch him if the mountain decided it wanted him. Nico was moving faster than he should have been. The gauze wrap on his left shoulder was already soaking through, a dark bloom spreading across the white fabric with the patient inevitability of ink on paper. His face was the color of old concrete, but his feet were sure, and his eyes were sharp, and he hadn't made a sound since they'd started the descent. The pain was there. Ronan could see it in the way Nico's jaw muscles bunched with every step, the way his breathing hitched on the steeper drops. But Nico had spent 20 years converting pain into fuel, and whatever was burning inside him now was keeping his legs moving. The helicopter sound grew louder, not directly overhead, off to the east, circling the ridge they'd just left, looking for them at the shaft exit. That gave them minutes, not hours. Once whoever was in that bird realized they weren't on the ridgeline, the search pattern would expand, and 4 men crashing through timber on a mountainside weren't exactly invisible. "How far to the main shaft?" Ronan called back without stopping. Elias had the blood-spotted survey printout in one hand, navigating while moving. "If the ventilation exit was where I think it was, the main shaft should intersect the old mining road about a mile downslope. The road connects to the service route where we hid the bikes." He paused to check the terrain against the map. "Maybe 40 minutes at this pace." "We don't have 40 minutes, Nico said. First word since the ridge. His voice was thin, stripped of everything except information. "Then we go faster." They went faster. The slope channeled into a narrow ravine where a seasonal creek had cut through the bedrock, creating a natural staircase of flat stone and gravel. Easier footing, more speed, more noise. Their boots splashed through standing water and cracked against loose rock, sending echoes up the ravine walls that might as well have been signal flares. Ronan didn't care. Speed had become more important than stealth. The math was simple. Reach the bikes before the search pattern found them, or get caught on the mountain with no way out, and evidence that certain people would kill to destroy. The ravine opened onto a shelf of level ground where the old mining road appeared exactly where Elias said it would. A graded track, heavily overgrown but still discernible, running roughly east-west along the mountainside. Ronan stopped, breathed. His lungs burned from the altitude and the pace. Sweat had soaked through his shirt despite the cold. He could feel the journals against his chest, warm now from his body heat. Callum's words pressed against his skin like a conversation conducted through paper and time. Mac arrived next, bent double, hands on his knees, sucking air, then Elias and Nico. They stood on the old road in the gray dawn and listened. The helicopter had moved. Its sound was fainter now, drifting south. Still searching the ridge, they'd bought themselves a window. How large? Nobody could say. Bikes are east, Nico said. He'd oriented himself despite the pain, the blood loss, the descent that would have put a lesser man on the ground. Half-mile, maybe less. The stand of fur where we cached them should be just past the barricade. If the bikes are still there, Max said. Nobody responded to that, because if the bikes were gone, so were they. They moved east on the mining road, staying low, keeping to the overgrown edges where the brush provided marginal cover. The light was strengthening, that thin, steel-colored dawn that November produces in the Cascades, where the sun never fully commits and the world stays trapped in a permanent state of almost. Ronan could see farther now, and what he saw didn't help. The service road below them, the one they'd driven in on last night, had fresh tire tracks. Multiple vehicles, heavy. The mud had been churned into deep ruts that glistened like wounds. They'd been right. Someone had driven in after them. Multiple vehicles. Multiple men. An organized operation moving with enough resources and speed to respond within hours. The barricade came into view around a bend in the mining road. The interlocking fallen trees that had blocked their path the night before looked different in the daylight, more deliberate, more engineered. The chainsaw cuts visible even from 50 yards away. And beyond the barricade, partially visible through the timber, 2 vehicles were parked on the logging road, black SUVs. Engine hoods still warm enough to generate faint vapor in the cold air. No one visible, but the driver's door of the nearest vehicle was open. Ronan raised his fist. Everyone stopped. He crouched behind a deadfall log and studied the scene. The SUVs were positioned to block the logging road in both directions. Professional, tactical, the kind of placement that said these weren't amateurs. These were people who had done this before, who had experience controlling access to remote areas and containing situations that threatened to become public. The bikes are 30 yards past the second SUV, Nico whispered. He was on his belly beside Ronan, his wounded arm tucked against his chest, his good hand pointing through a gap in the underbrush. I can see Max Road King. The branches are disturbed, but the bikes are still there. Guards? Can't see any, but the open door says someone's close. Elias had moved 10 yards to the right, higher up the slope, getting a different angle. He came back in a low crouch. 2 men, both on the far side of the second vehicle. One's on a radio, the other's standing at the tree line with a flashlight, scanning the woods. They're looking for us up there. He pointed toward the ridge. Not down here. Not yet, Ronan calculated. 30 yards of open ground between their position and the bikes. 2 men between them and the road. More men somewhere on the mountain above, presumably converging on the shaft exit. A helicopter that could reposition in minutes once the search area shifted. And Nico, who was bleeding through his bandage and running on willpower and whatever chemical cocktail the human body produces when it refuses to acknowledge that it's been damaged. We go straight through, Ronan said. Mac looked at him. Through. Between the vehicles. To the bikes. We start the engines and we ride. By the time they react, we're past the barricade and on the main road. The barricade is still there, Ronan. Chainsaw-cut timber across the road. We can't ride through logs. We go around, off-road, 20 feet into the tree line and back onto the gravel past the barricade. I've done worse on sand in Helmand. You were 25 in Helmand. And I'm 38 now with bad knees and my brother's journals inside my jacket. We go through. Max stared at him. Then he looked at Elias. Elias looked at Nico. Nico was already moving, pushing himself to his feet with his good arm, his face tight and bloodless. On your call, Nico said to Ronan. They spread out. Mac went left, circling wide through the timber to approach the bikes from the far side. Elias and Nico went right, toward the SUVs, positioned to create a distraction if needed. Ronan went straight down the slope toward the gap between the two vehicles, moving fast, staying low. His boots finding purchase on the wet ground with the instinctive precision of a body that remembered how to do this, even when the mind was somewhere else entirely. He was 20 yards from the vehicles when the man with the radio saw him. The moment stretched. Ronan was in the open. No cover, no concealment, just a man in a leather jacket running downhill toward two black SUVs on a mountain road in the November dawn. The radio man was lean, mid-40s, wearing a tactical jacket and hiking boots. His hand dropped from the radio to his hip, reaching for something Ronan couldn't see. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the sudden recognition that the situation had just changed faster than his planning had accounted for. "Contact!" the radio man shouted. "They're here! On the road!" The second man spun from the tree line, flashlight in one hand, something dark and angular in the other. Ronan didn't stop to identify it. He was moving on instinct now, the deep pre-verbal programming that combat installs in the nervous system and never uninstalls. Close the distance. Don't give them time to set. Make them react instead of act. He hit the gap between the vehicles at a full sprint and collided with the radio man shoulder first. The impact was brutal. 200 pounds of momentum transferred through Ronan's right shoulder into the man's chest. They went down together, hitting the muddy road surface with a sound like a sack of wet concrete dropping from a truck. The radio skidded across the gravel. Ronan rolled off the man, scrambled to his feet, and kept running. He didn't look back. Looking back was how you died. Behind him, chaos. Elias and Nico had emerged from the timber on the right. Nico, one-armed, bleeding, pale as paper, stepped directly into the path of the second man with a calm deliberation that was more terrifying than aggression. He didn't swing, didn't charge. He just stood there, occupying space, his dark eyes locked onto the man with the same unblinking steadiness that had unnerved interrogators in 3 countries. The man hesitated. 1 second. That was all Nico needed. Elias came from behind, grabbed the man's arm, twisted it in a motion that was pure muscle memory from 20 years of field medicine and the combat training that came with it, and drove him sideways into the SUV's fender. The man's head hit the metal with a sound Ronan heard from 30 yards away. Mac reached the bikes first. He tore the branches away from his road cane with 2 massive sweeps of his arms, threw his leg over the saddle, and hit the ignition. The engine caught immediately, a deep, thunderous roar that rolled down the logging road and bounced off the mountain walls, like a declaration of war. He kicked the stand and rolled the bike forward, clearing a path for the others. Ronan reached his Harley, ripped the last branch off the handlebars. His hands were shaking, adrenaline, not cold, not fear, just the raw electrical overload of a body running at combat RPM after 15 years of civilian idle. The key was in his pocket. He jammed it in, turned it, hit the starter. The lowrider coughed once, twice, then caught and settled into its familiar growl, the sound of something reliable in a world that had proven to be anything but. Elias's Sportster started clean, Nico's Dyna. Nico mounted it one-handed, kicked the starter with a motion that cost him something visible, a wince that pulled his entire face tight, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the chrome. The engine fired. 4 bikes. 4 engines. The sound filled the narrow corridor of the logging road with a combined roar that vibrated in the chest cavity and drowned out every other sound on the mountain. Ronan looked back. The radio man was on his feet, staggering, reaching for the radio on the ground. The second man was slumped against the SUV, conscious but not moving fast. Behind them, from higher on the mountain, the helicopter sound was changing, growing louder, the pitch shifting as the rotors tilted, and the aircraft moved toward their position. Someone had heard the engines. Someone had radioed in. "Go!" Ronan shouted. He didn't wait to see if they followed. He dropped into first gear and hammered the throttle, sending the Harley lurching forward on the muddy road. The barricade was ahead. 30 feet of interlocked timber blocking the track. Ronan veered right, off the road, into the tree line. The bike bucked over roots and rocks, the suspension bottoming out, branches whipping against his face and arms. Pine needles sprayed from the front tire like water. He threaded between two firs with maybe 6 inches of clearance on each side, the handlebars almost catching on bark. And then he was past the barricade, back on the gravel, the road opening ahead of him like a throat gasping for air. Mac came through behind him, his road king plowing a wider path through the underbrush, snapping a sapling like a matchstick. Then Elias, nimble on the lighter Sportster, finding gaps that didn't exist until she created them. Then Nico, one-handed, bleeding, riding with his knees and his right hand and whatever was left of his will, bouncing over a root that nearly threw him, catching the bike with a correction that would have been impressive under any circumstances, and was miraculous under these. They hit the main logging road and opened up. First gear. Second. Third. The road was rough. Ruts, puddles, loose gravel, but it was wide enough and straight enough to build speed. 30 miles per hour. 40. The cold air hit Ronan's face like a blade. His eyes watered. The trees blurred into a green-black corridor on either side. Behind them, the helicopter cleared the ridge and banked toward the road, its searchlight stabbing through the dawn like a white finger pointing at exactly where they were. The searchlight swept the road 20 yards behind Nico's rear tire. Then 10. The helicopter was descending, trying to get ahead of them, trying to force them to stop. The rotor wash hit the treetops and sent a cascade of water and needles raining down onto the road. Ronan ducked his head and pushed the throttle harder. 50 miles per hour on a gravel logging road with no guardrails and a 1,000-foot drop on the left side was suicide. He did it anyway, because the alternative was worse than dying. The alternative was stopping, being caught, and watching everything Callum had sacrificed be destroyed. The logging road connected to the paved highway 3 miles later. Ronan could see it ahead. A T-intersection where gravel met asphalt and the real world began. The helicopter was directly above them now, the downdraft so strong it pushed the bike sideways. Ronan fought the handlebars, correcting, his arms burning with the effort. And then they were on pavement. The tires gripped. The bike surged forward with the sudden confidence of machines on the surface they were designed for. 60 miles per hour. 70. The helicopter fell back on a paved highway with civilian traffic. A low-flying helicopter became a liability. Visible, questionable, the kind of thing that generated phone calls and witnesses. Ronan checked his mirrors. Mac was behind him, solid, steady, his road king eating the highway with the patient hunger of a machine built for exactly this. Elias was tucked in tight, drafting behind Mac's profile. Nico was last, and even in the small mirror, Ronan could see the dark stain on his jacket sleeve had spread to his hand, blood wicking down his wrist and dripping onto the tank. They needed to stop. Nico needed medical attention, real attention, not a field wrap on a mountainside, but stopping meant being found. The highway had cameras, gas stations had cameras, and whoever had sent the SUVs and the helicopter had resources that suggested they could access those cameras. Ronan took the next exit, then a county road, then a farm road that wound through timber country with no houses, no cameras, no witnesses. They rode for 20 minutes on that road before Ronan saw what he needed. An abandoned lumber mill set back from the road in a clearing surrounded by second-growth fir. The main building was a corrugated steel structure with a collapsed roof. But the outbuilding, a smaller steel shed, probably a maintenance shop, still had its walls and most of its roof, and a door that hung open on rusted hinges. He pulled in, killed the engine. The others followed. The sudden silence, after the sustained roar of 4 engines and 20 minutes of highway speed, was physically disorienting, like going deaf, except the opposite. Every small sound became enormous, the tick of cooling metal, the drip of water from the shed's damaged gutter, Nico's breathing, which had developed a wet rattle that Elias heard before anyone else. "Inside," Elias said, not a suggestion. They got Nico off his bike. Mac took one side, Ronan the other. Nico tried to walk on his own, and his left leg buckled, the blood loss finally asserting its authority over the willpower that had been overriding it. They half-carried him into the shed and lowered him onto a wooden workbench that was covered in sawdust and old grease. Elias was already cutting away the soaked bandage. The wound was worse than it had looked on the mountain, deeper, the edges ragged, still bleeding from a vessel that the field wrap hadn't fully compressed. "I need to close this," Elias said. His voice was clinical, detached. The medic's voice, the one that separated the man from the task because combining them would make the task impossible. "Butterfly strips won't hold. It needs sutures." "You've got sutures in your kit?" Mac asked. "I've got a needle and dental floss." Nico's laugh was a broken sound, half air, half pain. "Dental floss. Waxed. Mint flavor." Elias was already threading the needle. His hands, which had been bloody and shaking on the mountain, were perfectly still now. The battlefield had steadied him the way it always did, the crisis providing the clarity that ordinary life couldn't. "This is going to hurt. Everything hurts. Just do it." Ronan stepped outside. He couldn't watch, not because of the blood. He'd seen worse in Fallujah, had held a man's intestines inside his body cavity for 40 minutes while waiting for a medevac that came 38 minutes too late. He stepped outside because if he stood in that shed and watched Nico get stitched up with dental floss, the rage would take him somewhere he couldn't come back from. And he needed to come back. The journals needed him to come back. He leaned against the shed wall. The corrugated steel was cold against his back. He pulled Callum's photograph from his jacket and looked at it in the gray morning light. 6 faces. 6 people who had survived a wildfire and been buried alive by the people who started it. 6 people who had chosen to hide, to wait, to trust that the truth would eventually surface, and had paid for that choice with everything. The last journal entry he'd read flashed through his mind. Callum's handwriting. "He'll be on Route 9 in November. He'll still be looking. He won't stop." "You were right, Cal," Ronan said quietly. "I didn't stop." The sound of tires on gravel made him straighten. A vehicle was approaching on the farm road, moving slowly. Ronan dropped the photograph inside his jacket and pressed himself against the shed wall, peering around the corner. A truck. Not one of the black SUVs. An old Ford pickup, rust brown, with a camper shell and plates that were caked with road dirt. It pulled into the lumber mill clearing and stopped. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She was tall, late 30s. Dark hair pulled back in a knot that was coming undone. She wore a canvas field jacket, hiking boots, and the expression of someone who had been driving for a long time and was not entirely sure she'd arrived at the right place. Her eyes scanned the clearing, the abandoned mill, the shed, the 4 motorcycles parked in a line outside it. When her gaze found Ronan, she stopped. "Ronan Vale," she said. His body went rigid. "Who's asking?" "My name is Lena Ash." She took one step forward. Her hands were visible, open, empty, but her eyes were hard, not aggressive, but prepared. The eyes of someone who had been through something that had stripped away everything soft. "My mother was Dr. Marin Ash. She was on Cruise 7 at Black Ridge." The name detonated inside Ronan's chest. Marin Ash, the woman in the photograph, the one standing beside Callum with the strong jaw and the fierce eyes, the Forest Service ecologist who had argued that the families deserved to know their people were alive. "Your mother," Ronan said. "She went with your brother through the mining shaft when Everett's people found the bunker." Lena's voice was controlled, but the control was costing her. Ronan could see it in the tendons of her neck, the way her fingers curled and uncurled at her sides. She went with him to get the evidence out, and she didn't come back either. The air between them felt charged. 2 people standing on opposite sides of the same wound, finally close enough to see each other across it. Ronan's mind was processing faster than his emotions could follow. Marin had gone with Callum, through the shaft, with the evidence, and neither of them had made it. "How did you find us?" Ronan asked. Jesse called me. Jesse. He's my cousin's son. My uncle was the last survivor, the one who found Crew 7 after the fire. He spent his whole life protecting what they'd hidden. When he died last month, Jesse was the only one left. Lena's eyes glistened, but her voice held. I've been watching from a distance. For years, waiting for someone to follow the map. When Jesse told me you'd actually gone up the mountain, I drove through the night. Mac appeared in the shed doorway. His eyes moved from Ronan to the woman to the truck and back. Who is this? Marin Ash's daughter. Mac went very still. Lena looked past Ronan into the shed where Nico was lying on the workbench with Elias bent over his shoulder. Her face tightened. You need to move, all of you. The people behind this, they have resources you don't understand. Everett Parish isn't just a consulting firm. It's a front. The real operation was resource extraction, illegal mining in the national forest. The wildfire was set to destroy evidence of the operation and kill the rescue crew that had stumbled onto it. My mother figured it out. She documented everything. That's what she and your brother were carrying when they went through the shaft. Where did they go? Ronan's voice was barely controlled. After the shaft. Where did they go? Lena's composure cracked, just for a moment. A fracture line across her face that revealed the depth of what lay beneath. I don't know. I was a teenager when she disappeared. I was told she died in the fire like everyone else. I didn't learn the truth until my uncle told me 3 years ago. He said she and Callum made it out of the shaft. He said they had the evidence. And then she stopped, swallowed. He said Everett's people caught up with them before they could reach anyone who could help. The words hung in the cold air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Caught up with them. Ronan heard what she wasn't saying. The silence around those words was louder than the words themselves. Are they alive? He asked. Even as he said it, he knew the answer. He'd known it since reading Callum's journal. His brother hadn't written those words like a man who expected to survive. He'd written them like a man who expected to be found. Not rescued, not saved, but found. Past tense. By someone who came after. Lena shook her head, slowly, once. Her eyes didn't leave his. My uncle found their remains 2 years after the fire, in the forest below the shaft exit. He buried them himself, marked the location so it could be found again if it ever mattered. Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. He said your brother was still holding the documents when he found him. He'd put them inside his jacket, against his chest, like he was trying to protect them with his body even after. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Ronan turned away, faced the shed wall, put both hands flat against the cold steel, and pressed until his arms shook and the metal groaned against its rivets. The sound that came out of him wasn't a word, wasn't a cry. It was something from deeper than language, a sound that belonged to the place where grief and rage and love occupy the same space and can't be separated because they've grown together like roots in the same soil. Mac's hand landed on his back, heavy, steady, not pulling him away from it, just being there, bearing witness, the way brothers do when there's nothing to say and everything to feel, and the only thing that keeps a man from coming apart is the knowledge that someone else is standing close enough to hold the pieces. Ronan breathed. 1 breath. 2. 3. He pushed off the wall, turned around. His face was wet, but his eyes were clear, cleared somehow, the way a landscape is clear after a storm strips away everything that wasn't bolted down and leaves only what's real. You said your uncle marked the location. Lena nodded. Can you take us there? Yes, but not now. Right now you need to get those journals to someone who can protect them. Federal jurisdiction. State police won't touch it. Too many county connections. You need the FBI, or a U.S. attorney, or a journalist with enough reach that burying the story becomes more dangerous than letting it run. I know someone, Elias said from the shed doorway. He'd finished with Nico. The wounded man was sitting upright on the workbench now, pale but conscious, his shoulder wrapped in a clean bandage from Lena's truck. Elias wiped his hands on a rag. A federal prosecutor in Portland. We served together. She's not the type to be pressured. Portland is 4 hours, Max said. Then we ride 4 hours. Nico was on his feet, swaying slightly. His eyes were glassy from pain and blood loss, but his jaw was set in that particular configuration that everyone in the group recognized. The look that said arguing with him was a waste of time that could be better spent moving. "I can ride," Nico said. "You can barely stand," Elias countered. "I can ride. Put me on the bike and I can ride." From the farm road came a sound that ended the debate. Engines, multiple, growing louder, and this time not diesel, gasoline, fast, SUVs or trucks moving at speed on the narrow gravel road, getting closer with every second. Lena's head snapped toward the road. "They tracked my phone. I should have—" She didn't finish. She was already moving, pulling keys from her pocket, running for her truck. "Follow me. I know a back route to the highway. It comes out 20 miles south. They won't expect that direction." Ronan didn't hesitate. He was on his Harley in 3 seconds, engine turning over in 5. Mac mounted his Road King, Elias his Sportster. Nico climbed onto his dyno with a movement that was pure agony converted into action. His teeth clenched, his good hand white-knuckled on the grip, a sound escaping his throat that he would deny making for the rest of his life. Lena's truck spun out of the clearing first, fishtailing on the gravel, heading away from the approaching engines on a narrow track that cut through the timber to the south. The 4 bikes followed, single file, engines roaring, the sound rolling through the trees like a battle cry from machines that had been built for open roads and were being asked to perform in a war zone. The track was barely a road, 2 tire ruts with grass growing between them, winding through dense second-growth timber, climbing and descending with the terrain's contours. Lena drove fast, the pickup bouncing over rocks and roots, its camper shell rattling. Ronan stayed close behind her taillights, matching her speed, trusting her knowledge of the route because there was no other option. Behind them, the engine sounds from the clearing changed. Braking, stopping, doors slamming, voices. Then, after a pause that felt like an indrawn breath, the engine started again, following on the same track. The pursuit lasted 11 minutes. Ronan counted because counting was something his mind did under stress, a habit from combat that provided the illusion of control over situations that had none. 11 minutes of trees and mud and the hammering of engines and the constant pressure of knowing that the vehicles behind them were faster, heavier, and driven by people who had already demonstrated they were willing to kill to protect what had been buried on that mountain. At minute 7, the track crossed a creek, shallow, maybe a foot deep, with a rocky bottom. Lena's truck splashed through without slowing. The bikes followed, water spraying from the tires, engines sputtering as the exhaust pipes dipped below the surface, then catching again on the far side. But the creek gave Mac an idea. "The bridge!" Mac shouted over the engine noise. He was pointing ahead, where the track crossed a larger stream on a wooden bridge. 2 logs laid side by side with planks nailed across them, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. "If we drop it behind us," Ronan understood immediately. He pulled alongside Lena's truck and pounded on the driver's window. She rolled it down without slowing. "The bridge ahead. Can you get across?" "Yes." "Get across and stop. We need 60 seconds on the other side." Lena's truck hit the bridge at 30 miles per hour. The planks screamed under the weight. The entire structure flexed, but it held. She cleared the far side and braked hard, skidding to a stop in the mud. The bikes crossed one at a time, Ronan first, then Elias, then Nico, then Mac. The moment Mac's rear tire cleared the last plank, he and Ronan were off their bikes. The bridge's planks were nailed to the log stringers with old spikes, rusted, weakened by years of weather. Ronan grabbed the end of the first plank and pulled. It resisted. He pulled harder, planting his boot against the log for leverage. The nails groaned and gave. The plank came free. Then the next one. Mac was working the other side, ripping planks with his bare hands, the wood splintering, his fingers bleeding. Elias joined them. In 45 seconds, they'd torn away enough planking to create a 6-foot gap in the bridge surface, too wide for any vehicle to cross without dropping into the stream below. The pursuing vehicles appeared around the bend. 2 SUVs, black, moving fast. The lead driver saw the destroyed bridge and braked hard, the SUV's tires locking on the wet gravel. the vehicle sliding sideways before stopping 15 feet from the stream bank. For a moment, everything was still. The four bikers on one side, the SUVs on the other, the stream running between them with the indifferent persistence of water that has been following the same path since before anyone built a bridge over it. A man got out of the lead SUV. Tall, gray hair cropped close, a dark overcoat over a suit that had no business being on a mountain logging road. He stood at the edge of the broken bridge and looked across the stream at Ronan with an expression that was not anger, not frustration, but something colder, assessment. The look of a man calculating variables and adjusting a plan that had been disrupted but not defeated. "Mr. Vale!" The man's voice carried across the water with the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms where important decisions were made. "My name is Gavin Parrish. I believe you have something that belongs to my organization." Ronan stood beside his Harley, the journals pressed against his ribs, Callum's photograph pressed against his heart. His hands were bloody from the bridge planks. His body was exhausted. His brother was dead, truly dead now, confirmed, the last thread of impossible hope severed by Lena's words in the lumber mill clearing. And standing across 15 feet of mountain water was the man responsible for all of it. "Your organization buried 6 people alive," Ronan said. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had moved past rage into something harder and more durable. "Then you killed 2 of them when they tried to escape. Then you spent 15 years erasing every trace. And now you're standing here asking for the evidence back." Parrish didn't blink. "I'm standing here offering you a conversation. What happened on that mountain was a tragedy. Mistakes were made. But the people responsible are long gone, and the damage that would be done by releasing outdated, context-free documents into the public sphere would far exceed." "My brother's name was Callum Vale." Ronan's voice cut through Parrish's like a blade through paper. "He died holding the truth against his chest. You don't get to call that a mistake." Parrish studied him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Mac, to Elias, to Nico bleeding on his Dyna, to Lena standing beside her truck, calculating, weighing. "You're making an error," Parrish said quietly, almost gently. "You're assuming this ends with you delivering those documents to someone who cares. It doesn't. It ends with me making a phone call. And then it ends with you explaining to a very skeptical audience why 4 men with military records and a history of psychological issues broke into a restricted area, assaulted federal contractors, and stole classified documents from a sealed government site." The words landed with precision, because they were true, not the events, but the narrative. 4 veterans, PTSD, grief, obsession. It was the kind of story that wrote itself, the kind that people believed because it was easier than believing the alternative. Ronan looked at Parrish across the broken bridge. The stream between them was maybe 8 feet wide. The water was cold and clear and absolutely indifferent to human cruelty. And on this side of it, 4 broken men and 1 woman with a dead mother's name were holding the only copies of a truth that had survived fire, burial, and 15 years of systematic erasure. "Make your phone call," Ronan said. Then he swung his leg over the Harley, started the engine, and rode away, south, toward the highway, toward Portland, toward a federal prosecutor who might be the last honest person left in a system that had been built to protect men like Gavin Parrish. Behind him, 3 engines and 1 truck followed, and behind them, standing at the edge of a broken bridge on a mountain that had kept its secrets long enough, Gavin Parrish watched them go with the patience of a man who had buried the truth before and fully intended to do it again. The 4-hour ride to Portland nearly killed Nico Barrett. Not the wound. Elias's dental floss sutures held better than either of them expected, the waxed thread gripping the torn muscle with a stubbornness that matched the man wearing it. What nearly killed him was the cold. November wind at highway speed strips heat from the body faster than blood loss, and by the time they crossed into the Portland metro area on I-84, Nico was riding on autopilot, his good hand locked on the throttle in a grip that had gone beyond voluntary control into the territory of rigor, his body hunched forward over the tank, his face the color of candle wax. Max saw it first. He pulled alongside Nico's Dyna on the highway and reached across the gap between their bikes. An insane maneuver at 60 miles per hour. The kind of thing that only a man who'd spent 30 years on motorcycles would attempt. And put his hand on Nico's forearm. Not pulling, not steering, just touching, letting the warmth of contact remind a fading body that it wasn't alone. Nico's eyes found Max. Something passed between them that didn't require language. Nico nodded. A single, almost imperceptible movement. I'm still here. I'll make it. Lena led them through the city's east side on surface streets to avoid the highway cameras that Parrish would certainly be monitoring by now. Her rust-brown pickup moved through the gray Portland morning like a ship navigating familiar waters. Confident turns, no hesitation, the instinctive route knowledge of someone who had lived here long enough to know which streets had cameras and which didn't. They pulled into a parking garage beneath a federal building on the southwest 3rd Avenue at 9:14 in the morning. The concrete structure swallowed the engine sounds and gave them back as echoes, the 4 Harleys growling in a subterranean chorus that bounced off pillars and low ceilings, until the entire garage hummed like the inside of a machine. Elias made the call from a payphone in the lobby. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, his face carried an expression Ronan hadn't seen on him before. Something that looked almost like relief, except relief implies surprise, and what Elias was feeling seemed closer to confirmation. The look of a man who had placed a bet on human decency and been proven right. Her name is Catherine Bryce, Assistant U.S. Attorney. She's expecting us. 8th floor. Elias paused. I told her what we have. She didn't ask if we were sure. She asked how fast we could get there. They left Nico in Lena's truck with the engine running and the heater on full. He protested. Of course he protested. Nico would have protested being carried off a battlefield with both legs missing. But Elias put a hand on his chest and said, You've done enough. With a gentleness that cut through the argument the way gentleness sometimes does, when force can't. Nico looked at him, looked at the blood on his own hand, and sat back. The 8th floor of the federal building smelled like carpet cleaner and printer toner and the particular institutional stillness of places where important decisions are made slowly. Catherine Bryce met them in a conference room with a long table and windows that overlooked the Willamette River. She was small, 5'3", maybe 5'4", with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the kind of physical economy that suggested she had never in her life made an unnecessary movement. She looked at the 4 of them. Ronan in his mud-caked leather jacket, Mac with his bleeding hands wrapped in paper towels from the lobby bathroom, Elias with someone else's blood on his sleeves, and Lena Ash, who had driven through the night on 4 hours of sleep and a lifetime of waiting. And she didn't flinch. She closed the conference room door and said, Show me. Ronan laid the journals on the table, one by one, Callum's handwriting facing up. Then the photograph. Then the index card, Don't trust Everett in its plastic bag. Then the photocopied page Jesse had delivered with the margin note about the open shaft. Then Elias's phone, its primitive recording of 2 men discussing thermite charges and the destruction of DNA evidence. Catherine Bryce sat down. She put on her reading glasses. She opened the first journal and began to read. And the room went quiet with the particular density of silence that occurs when the truth, after 15 years underground, finally reaches someone with the authority to do something about it. She read for 45 minutes. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved except to shift weight from one foot to the other or to adjust a position in one of the conference room chairs. Ronan watched her face the way a defendant watches a jury, looking for tells, for reactions, for any sign that what she was reading was registering at the frequency it needed to register. Her expression gave away almost nothing, but her hands did. As she turned the pages of Callum's journal, her fingers slowed. By the time she reached the final entries, the description of the sealed hatch, the supply deliveries, the debate about surfacing, the decision to stay hidden, her hands had stopped moving entirely. She was holding the journal the way Ronan had held it in the bunker, like something alive. When she finished, she closed the journal carefully, placed her hands flat on the table, looked at Ronan. Your brother was a brave man. I know. This is enough for a federal investigation. Grand jury, subpoenas, the full apparatus. She removed her glasses. Her eyes were sharp, clear, absolutely certain. But I need to tell you what's going to happen, because it won't be fast and it won't be clean. And the people on the other side of this have had 15 years to build a firewall. Gavin Parrish will lawyer up within hours of being served. Everett Parrish Associates will claim the consulting work was legitimate and the fire origin report was accurate. They'll attack the chain of custody on these journals. They'll question how they were obtained. They'll put your military records and your psychological histories in front of a judge and argue that 4 PTSD-affected veterans broke into a restricted site and fabricated evidence. We didn't fabricate anything, Max said. I know that. You know that. But I'm telling you what they'll do because you need to understand that delivering these journals to me is not the end of this story. It's the beginning of a different one, a longer one. And I need to know that every person in this room is prepared for that. Ronan looked at Mac. Mac looked at Elias. Elias looked at Lena. Lena looked at Ronan. The circuit completed in silence, each pair of eyes carrying the same answer through a different frequency of pain. We've been carrying this for 15 years, Ronan said. We can carry it a little longer. Catherine Bryce nodded. Then she picked up the phone on the conference table and made 3 calls in rapid succession, each one short, each one conducted in the clipped language of someone activating a process that, once started, couldn't be stopped. Federal marshals for evidence custody. An FBI field office for investigative jurisdiction, a forensic document examiner to authenticate the journals before anyone could claim they'd been tampered with. By noon, the conference room had become a command center. 3 FBI agents in suits that didn't fit the occasion sat across from 4 bikers in leather and mud, recording statements with the careful neutrality of people trained to gather facts without judgment. Ronan told his story from the beginning. Route 9, the boy, the burned map. Mac corroborated. Elias provided the medical and forensic details. Lena filled in the gaps with what her uncle had told her before he died. Each statement was recorded, transcribed, and signed. Each piece of evidence was photographed, cataloged, and placed in a secure evidence bag with a chain of custody form that bore more signatures than some marriage certificates. Nico gave his statement from Lena's truck in the parking garage, where a paramedic, called by Catherine Bryce without being asked, was replacing Elias's dental floss with proper sutures and pumping a bag of saline into his arm through an IV that Nico stared at with the particular resentment of a man who hated needing anything from anyone. At 3 in the afternoon, Catherine Bryce stepped out of the conference room and told Ronan that federal agents were en route to the Black Ridge bunker. The thermite charges had been found and disarmed. The remaining evidence, filing cabinets, radio logs, personal effects, was being recovered intact. Gavin Parrish had been located at a hotel in Dunmore and served with a preservation order that prevented the destruction of any documents connected to Everett Parrish Associates. It's moving, she said, faster than I expected. Is that good? It means someone has been waiting for this to surface. Not everyone in the system was comfortable with how the investigation was closed. Some of them just needed a reason to reopen it. Ronan absorbed that. The idea that other people inside the system, people with authority, had carried their own doubts about Black Ridge for 15 years, that the silence hadn't been unanimous, that cracks had existed in the wall the whole time, waiting for the right pressure to break through. He thought about Callum, about a man sitting in a bunker, making the hardest decision of his life, to stay hidden, to let his family grieve, to protect the truth at the cost of everything personal, because he believed that someday, someone on the other side would be ready to hear it. Callum had bet his life on the existence of a Catherine Bryce. He'd never met her, never known her name, but he'd believed she existed, that somewhere in the system he was fighting against there was a person who would do the right thing if given the chance, and he'd been right. They left the federal building at 5 in the evening. The Portland sky was doing its November thing, low clouds, the color of old silverware, a light rain that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite mist, the kind of weather that made the city look like a photograph taken through frosted glass. The 4 motorcycles sat in the parking garage where they'd left them, engines cold, chrome dulled by road grime and mountain mud, and the residue of a journey that had covered more distance than any odometer could measure. Nico was sitting on the tailgate of Lena's truck, his arm in a proper sling now, his color better, an empty sailing bag hanging from the camper shell's roof rack like a strange flag. He looked up when they appeared. "What's the verdict?" "Federal investigation," Ronan said. "Grand jury. The works." Nico nodded, slowly, as if confirming something he'd already decided was true. "Good." He paused. "I'm hungry." They found a diner 6 blocks from the federal building. Not because it was good, it wasn't particularly, but because it was there, and it was open, and it had a booth big enough for 5 people and a counter where a woman with tired hands poured coffee without asking if you wanted some. The kind of place that existed in every American city, identical and irreplaceable, a temple of linoleum and burned coffee, and the particular democracy of hunger that puts everyone on the same level. They took the corner booth. Ronan slid in first, then Mac, then Elias. Nico and Lena took the opposite side. The table was scarred formica with a crack running through the middle that had been repaired with clear tape at some point in the distant past. The menus were laminated and sticky. The overhead light hummed with a frequency that was either comforting or maddening, depending on how long you'd been awake. Nobody spoke for a while. They sat in the booth and let the warmth of the diner work its way into their bodies, into the joints and muscles that had been running on adrenaline and cold air for the better part of 24 hours, into the deeper places where exhaustion lives when it's not just physical. The waitress brought coffee. 5 mugs. Black, without being told. Maybe she could read the room. Maybe she'd served enough people who looked like they'd been through something to know that milk and sugar weren't what was needed. Mac wrapped both hands around his mug. His knuckles were torn from ripping bridge planks. The paper towels were gone, replaced by bandages that Elias had applied in the federal building bathroom with the same competence he applied to everything, quietly, completely, without being asked. Mac stared into the coffee like it contained answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. "I need to call my wife," he said. "Tell her I'm not coming home tonight." "What are you going to say?" "The truth." Mac's mouth twisted. Not a smile, something more complicated. "She's been waiting for me to tell her the truth about something for 20 years. Might as well start with this." He got up and walked to the front of the diner, pulling his phone from his pocket. Ronan watched him through the window, standing on the sidewalk in the rain, talking into the phone with one hand pressed against his forehead. His body curved inward the way bodies curve when they're releasing something heavy. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. When Mac came back to the booth, his eyes were red, but his shoulders were different. Lower, looser, unburdened by some fraction of what he'd been carrying. "She cried," he said. Then she told me she already knew something was wrong with the official story because she'd looked into it herself in 2014 and couldn't make the timeline add up. She just never told me because she thought it would send me back to a bad place. He shook his head. Something that was almost a laugh escaped his chest. 14 years of marriage, and we were both keeping the same secret for the same reason. The food came. Eggs, toast, bacon that was slightly too crisp, and hash browns that were slightly too soft. Nobody complained. They ate with the focused, wordless dedication of people refueling after extended output. Forks moving, jaws working, the simple animal satisfaction of calories entering a system that had been running on empty. Ronan ate 2 eggs and 3 pieces of toast and drank 2 cups of coffee and tasted none of it. The warmth was the point. The ritual of sitting at a table with people and putting food into the body. The declaration, made through the mundane act of eating, that they were alive and intended to stay that way. Lena sat beside Nico, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her eyes distant. She'd been quiet since the federal building, not withdrawn, present, attentive, tracking every conversation, but quiet in the way of someone processing a seismic shift. Her mother's disappearance had defined the architecture of her adult life the way Callum's had defined Ronan's. And now that architecture was being rebuilt, the blueprints redrawn, every room rearranged by new information that didn't change the loss, but changed its shape. "My mother and your brother," she said, looking at Ronan. "They went through the shaft together. My uncle said—" She paused, set down her mug. He said they argued about who would carry the documents and who would go ahead to check the route. Your brother insisted on carrying them. My mother insisted on going first because she knew the terrain from her ecology fieldwork. They compromised the way two stubborn people compromise. They both carried half, and they went together. Ronan listened. His throat was tight, but his eyes were steady. My uncle found them side by side, in a clearing about a mile below the shaft exit. He said it looked like they'd been... She stopped, breathed. He said it looked like they'd stopped to rest, like they thought they were safe. He said your brother's arm was across my mother's shoulders. The booth was silent. The diner hummed around them, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the murmur of other customers, the hiss of the coffee machine. Small, ordinary sounds that continued because the world doesn't pause for grief, not even grief this deep, not even grief this old. She sounds like someone Cal would have liked, Ronan said. His voice was rough, but it held. She would have liked him too. Lena almost smiled. Not quite. The ghost of a smile, the shape of one, without the weight. She liked people who were stubborn for the right reasons. Elias reached across the table and topped off Lena's coffee from the carafe the waitress had left. A small gesture. Practical. The kind of thing he did without thinking because taking care of people was wired into him at a level that preceded thought. Lena looked at him. Something passed between them. Not romance, not attraction, but recognition. The acknowledgement of one caretaker by another. They stayed in that diner for 2 hours. The rain outside picked up, then eased, then picked up again. The light shifted from gray to slightly less gray, which in Portland passed for improvement. Mac called his wife twice more. Short calls. The kind where most of the communication happens in the silences between words. Nico fell asleep in the booth with his head tilted back against the vinyl, his breathing steady for the first time in 24 hours, the sling cradling his arm like something gentle in a world that hadn't been. Elias sat with his hands around his coffee and his eyes on the middle distance, processing in the way medics process, cataloging injuries, assessing outcomes, calculating what had been saved and what had been lost, and whether the ratio justified the cost. Ronan sat by the window and watched the rain. He was thinking about Route 9, about the 15 Novembers he'd ridden that road, alone, in the dark, on the anniversary of the day his brother disappeared. He'd done it every year without knowing why, without a destination, without a plan, just the need to be on that road at that time, as if the act of riding could keep something alive that had been declared dead. And it had. Not in the way he'd imagined. Not by bringing Callum back, but by being there. By being predictable. By being the man his brother had written about in a journal in the dark. The one who would be on Route 9 in November, still looking, who wouldn't stop. Callum had known him from 50 feet underground through years of separation and silence and the impossible distance between the living and the dead. Had known that Ronan would come back to that road every year because Ronan couldn't not come back. And he'd built his entire escape plan around that knowledge. The burned map. The boy. The chain of custody that led from a dying old man to a 10-year-old's hands to a rain-soaked highway on the exact night that Ronan would be there to receive it. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was love, expressed in the only language Callum had ever been fluent in. Planning, precision, the careful architecture of a mission designed to succeed even if the architect didn't survive to see it. The phone on the table buzzed, Elias's flip phone. He opened it, read the message, and looked up. Catherine Bryce, they've recovered the bunker, everything intact, and they've identified the remains at the site Lena's uncle marked. He paused. His voice was quiet, but absolutely steady. 2 individuals. Preliminary identification consistent with Callum Vale and Dr. Marin Ash. Full confirmation pending DNA analysis. The words settled into the diner like snow settling on a field, quietly, completely, covering everything. Ronan closed his eyes. He felt Mac's hand grip his shoulder from the seat beside him. Felt the pressure, firm, sustained, not letting go. The hand of a man who had loved Callum too, in the way that soldiers love each other, in the way that people who have shared the worst parts of life together are bonded by a material stronger than blood. "They'll be brought home," Ronan said. Not a question, a statement, a promise made to a diner booth in a rain-streaked window, and the memory of a man who had carried the truth as far as his body would allow, and then entrusted it to the people who came after. "They'll be brought home," Elias confirmed. 3 weeks later, Ronan stood at a memorial overlooking Black Ridge. The November sky had cleared for the first time in weeks, not sunny, but open, the clouds pulling apart like curtains to reveal a blue so deep it hurt to look at. The mountain below was scarred. Even after 15 years, the fire's path was visible, a broad swath of younger growth cutting through older forest, the landscape's scar tissue, proof that healing and damage can occupy the same ground. The memorial was simple. A granite marker set into the earth at the overlook's edge, engraved with 6 names. The members of Crew 7, Black Ridge Volunteer Rescue. Callum Vale's name was 3rd from the top. Dr. Marin Ash's was 4th. Below the names a single line, "They stayed so the truth could survive." The federal investigation had moved faster than Catherine Bryce predicted. Gavin Parrish had been arrested 6 days after the journals were delivered. Everett Parish Associates was dissolved and its records seized. The original fire origin report was formally discredited. 3 county officials who had participated in the cover-up cooperated in exchange for reduced charges, and their testimony painted a picture that confirmed everything Callum's journals described: an illegal mining operation on federal land, a wildfire set to destroy the evidence, a rescue crew that stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time, and a 15-year campaign of silence that required the systematic erasure of every trace of what had actually happened. The families of Crew 7 had been notified. 6 families scattered across 3 states who had grieved and moved on and built new lives on top of empty graves. The notifications were handled by Catherine Bryce personally. Ronan didn't know the details. He didn't need to. Some doors are opened by the people inside, not by the people knocking. Ronan stood at the memorial with the burned map's ashes in a small steel container. The map had disintegrated over the course of the journey, edges crumbling, charred paper breaking apart, the fire damage that had preserved it for 15 years finally completing its work. By the time they reached Portland, it was fragments. By the time the investigation concluded, it was dust. Its purpose was complete. It had found the person it was meant to find and led him to the place it was meant to lead. He opened the container and let the ashes settle onto the granite beside Callum's name. The wind caught some of them and carried them over the edge of the overlook, out over the valley, toward the mountain where the bunker had been, where the cots still stood in their careful rows, where the mugs and the coffee can and the harmonica were being cataloged by federal evidence teams who handled each object with the reverence of people who understood they were touching the artifacts of a sacrifice. Max stood to his left, cleaned up, shaved for the first time in weeks. He wore a dark jacket over a flannel shirt, and his Road King was parked in the lot behind them, gleaming, detailed with the obsessive care of a man whose relationship with his motorcycle was one of the few things in his life that made consistent sense. His wife, Sarah, was there too, a quiet woman with steady eyes who had driven up from Boise and stood beside her husband with the patient solidity of someone who had been waiting a long time for this day without knowing it was coming. Elias stood to his right, silent, still. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his eyes were on the mountain. Ronan hadn't asked what Elias was thinking. He didn't need to. He knew. Elias was standing at the memorial of a man he'd declared dead, a man whose death he'd certified with a signature on a form while a county official stood over his shoulder, and he was letting the weight of that signature finally lift, not disappear. Weights like that don't disappear, but lift, enough to breathe under, enough to stand upright, enough to look at the sky without feeling the ceiling. Nico was there, his arm still in a sling, his scar catching the light. He stood slightly apart from the group, the way he always stood, close enough to be reached, far enough to maintain the perimeter his nervous system required. But his eyes were different. Something behind them had quieted. Not the vigilance, that would never leave, was as much a part of him as the scar on his jaw, but the restlessness, The constant scanning alertness that had kept him awake for 20 years had found, if not peace, then something adjacent to it. Purpose served. Mission complete. Permission finally to stand down. Lena stood beside the memorial with a small bouquet of wildflowers. Mountain asters, the kind that grew in the high meadows above Black Ridge. The kind her mother had studied before the fire changed everything. She placed them at the base of the granite and rested her hand on the stone for a long moment. When she stood up, her eyes found Ronan's. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, quiet, complete. Ronan nodded. There was more to say. There would always be more to say between these 2 people who had lost the people they loved most to the same mountain and the same crime and the same stubborn dedication to a truth that nearly died with them. But not today. Today was for the silence, for the space between words where the real things lived. Jesse was there, standing beside Lena, wearing shoes for the first time since Ronan had met him. New sneakers, clean jeans, a jacket that fit. Lena had taken him in. Not formally, not yet. The legal process was still unfolding, but functionally, completely, with the quiet decisiveness of a woman who recognized a child in need of protection and responded the way her mother would have responded. Jesse stood straight at the memorial, his eyes on the mountain, his face still carrying that expression that was too old for him, but was, Ronan noticed, beginning to soften. The mission his grandfather had given him was complete. The weight he'd been carrying, the burned map, the clues, the desperate responsibility of being the last link in a chain that stretched back 15 years, had been transferred to shoulders broad enough to bear it. He was 10 years old. He could start being 10 years old now. Ronan crouched beside him, the way he'd crouched on Route 9 in the rain, the night everything started. Eye level, hands visible, voice low. "Your grandfather was right about me," Ronan said. Jesse looked at him. "I know. He was brave, what he did, keeping the evidence, protecting it, finding a way to get it to me through you. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot." Jesse's lower lip trembled. Just barely. The crack in the composure that Ronan had first seen at the motel parking lot, widening now, letting the 10-year-old underneath finally surface. "He told me you'd say that." Ronan almost smiled. "Yeah?" He said bikers always know when someone's brave because they spend their whole lives being scared and doing things anyway. Ronan looked at the boy, at the mountain behind him, at the memorial with 6 names and a line about truth. He put his hand on Jesse's shoulder, gently, briefly, the way you touch something precious that doesn't belong to you. "Your grandfather was right about that too." They stood at the overlook for another hour. The sky stayed open. The wind carried the smell of pine and cold stone and the faint, distant sweetness of snow on higher peaks. The mountain below them was quiet in the way mountains are quiet. Not silent, but full. Every sound absorbed and held and released slowly. The breathing of something ancient that had witnessed everything and judged nothing. One by one, they returned to their vehicles. Mac and Sarah first, his arm around her shoulders, walking to the Road King with the unhurried gait of a man who finally had somewhere he wanted to go. Then Elias, who shook Ronan's hand with both of his, and held it for 3 seconds longer than a handshake requires. 3 seconds that contained 7 years of apology and 7 years of forgiveness, compressed into the pressure of 2 palms and the steady meeting of 2 pairs of eyes. Then Nico, who said nothing because Nico's eloquence had always lived in his silences, and the silence he offered Ronan as he walked to his Dinah was the most articulate thing he'd ever communicated. A silence that said, "I would do all of it again," and meant it completely. Lena and Jesse left last. The rust-brown pickup pulled out of the lot slowly, Jesse's face visible in the passenger window, looking back at the memorial until the road curved and the mountain took it from view. Ronan watched them go. Something settled in his chest. Not closure, because closure was a word for doors, and doors implied rooms you could leave. And the room Callum's death occupied inside him had no exit, and never would. But something, an easing, a lessening of the pressure that had been building for 15 years, released not all at once but gradually, the way a fist unclenches when the body finally believes the fight is over. Ronan was the last to leave. He stood at the memorial alone, the wind pulling at his jacket, the ashes of the burned map already invisible against the dark granite. He placed one final object beside the stone, Callum's badge, recovered from the bunker, restored and polished by federal technicians who had handled it with the care of people who understood that a badge is never just a badge. It was identity, proof of service, evidence that a man had existed, had mattered, had given everything. The badge caught the light. A mountain ridge, a single flame, 2 crossed axes. "I found it, Cal," Ronan said quietly. "Everything you hid, everything you protected, it's out now. It's not going back in the ground." The wind was his only answer, but it was enough. He walked to his Harley, threw his leg over the saddle. The leather was cold, but it warmed quickly. It always did, this bike, this machine that had carried him through 15 Novembers and 1,000 miles of grief and one impossible journey into a mountain that had tried to keep its secrets forever. The engine turned over on the first kick. The sound was deep, familiar, the mechanical heartbeat that had been the most reliable thing in his life for longer than he wanted to count. He pulled out of the lot and onto the highway heading south. The road was empty. The sky was open. The mountain fell away behind him, growing smaller in his mirrors, until it was just a shape on the horizon, a ridge against the sky, scarred but standing, holding the bones of brave people in its ancient soil. Ronan rode. Not toward anything, not away from anything, just riding. The engine beneath him, the wind around him, the road unspooling ahead with the patient generosity of a path that doesn't care where you've been or what you've lost, only that you're still moving forward. Some roads are never meant to lead people home. They exist so forgotten heroes can finally find theirs. And on a November afternoon in the Cascades, as a lone Harley descended from the mountains into the valley below, the road did exactly what it was built to do. It carried a man toward whatever came next. And for the first time in 15 years, Ronan Vale didn't look back.